Hey guys, tonight we slip through the crackling cold of a Nordic twilight and push open the heavy wooden door of a Viking longhouse. Your boots are soaked, your fingers are stiff. Your breath fogs instantly in the air as you're hit with a wave of heat smoke and the unmistakable smell of slightly burnt turnip stew. You're shivering, dripping, and unfortunately, a total stranger here, which means you're about to discover whether these hulking Norse folks follow their famous code of hospitality, or if you'll be politely turned into a wall decoration. The longhouse is dim lit, mostly by flickering torches in the orange glow of a central fire pit. The roof creaks in the wind, someone coughs, a dog growls softly, and you're thinking maybe you should have stayed back at that nice, non-axe-filled fjord. But here you are, hungry, cold, and about to gamble your life on whether your host is in a sharing mood. You probably won't survive this, unless you play it cool. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world we're falling asleep together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand awkwardly near the threshold, steam rising off your cloak as heads turn. You've got one chance to make the right impression. Thankfully, Viking etiquette, though unspoken, is surprisingly structured. Step 1, do not track snow across the floorboards. See to the Vikings, the threshold of a home wasn't just a place to wipe your feet. It was practically a magical line, a boundary between wild, chaotic nature and the somewhat civilized safety of the hearth. Cross it without permission, and you might as well announce you're here to steal the silverware. If they had silverware. They mostly had spoons. Someone clears their throat. You nod politely and whisper something about blessings from Thor. One old woman squints at you. Someone else gestures toward the fire. That's a good sign. You trudge forward, careful not to step on any sleeping dogs or sprawled out warriors. Yes, that's a real thing, and finally reach the edge of the hearth circle. Viking hospitality, or gestfrier as they called it, wasn't just about kindness. It was a social contract. If a guest was welcomed into your home and something terrible happened to them, say being poisoned, murdered, or forced to listen to a 6-hour saga about turnip farming, you, the host, were held responsible. Even Odin himself had rules about being a decent host. He also had a habit of showing up in disguise to test people. No pressure. You kneel by the fire, palms out, showing you mean no harm. This is key. In Norse culture, posture and gesture spoke louder than words, especially when most of your words are being drowned out by someone loudly belching a drinking song in the corner. You hold your hands up slow and open, and someone finally passes you a bowl. Hot broth, a good sign. Not poison, probably. Mainstream historians agree the Norse took hospitality seriously. It was a matter of honor, reputation, and communal survival in a land where blizzards didn't RSVP. But historians still argue whether this open-handed generosity extended to all travelers, or only those of certain status like fellow warriors, merchants, or wandering bards with a decent joke. If you were, say, a Saxon spy, slightly different experience. You sip the broth, it's salty, thin, and weirdly comforting. Around you, conversation resumes. You notice how people glance at you, quick assessing looks. Vikings were masters of silent judgments. Your clothes, your posture, your boots, all being cataloged for social ranking. Welcome to Norse social chess played with meat eyebrows and passive-aggressive silence. Suddenly, someone hands you a chunk of flatbread. Not the good kind, more like the emergency rations they keep under a bench. Still, you chew it dutifully. Hospitality doesn't mean a 5-star meal. It just means not dying of exposure in the snow, which, let's be honest, is a pretty low bar. Someone offers you mead, you take it. You toast to the hearth, the hall, and the herring, which earns you a chuckle. That's enough. You're in, for now. Later, as the night deepens and the fire settles into glowing embers, you'll be expected to earn your stay. Maybe tell a story, maybe help skin a rabbit, maybe just avoid stepping on the family goat. But right now, you're warm, vaguely full, and alive. That's a solid Viking win. Your hands are still thawing from the cold. But that bowl of hot broth has bought you precious time. You sit straighter, stretching your fingers toward the fire, trying not to look too greedy for warmth. Around you, the rhythm of the hall continues chatter chewing, slurping the occasional dog bark. And now it's your turn to notice something odd before anyone threw a glance at your travel-worn cloak or battle-scarred boots. They made sure your belly was full. Bread before bloodshed, as they say, or at least as some sagas hint. This rule wasn't just kindness, it was a survival mechanism. In Viking society, everyone was dangerous. Seriously, even the old woman knitting in the corner probably knew 10 ways to gut a fish in a man. So the very first thing a Viking host did when you crossed their threshold, if they meant to treat you decently, was offer food. Not out of generosity, mind you, out of tactical self-preservation. Feeding someone, even a stranger, did two things. First, it implied a temporary truce. You can't stab someone if you're both chewing on barley bread. Second, it reminded the guest, you now owe me. A bowl of stew might not seem like much, but in Viking logic, that simple act set the tone for every interaction that followed. You've been fed, you've been warmed. Therefore, you don't get to murder your host in their sleep tonight. That's how cozy this culture was. You watch a man tear a roasted root vegetable in half with his bare hands and offer the burnt side to a nearby boy. The boy takes it without a word. That too is part of the code, sharing silently without fuss. There's no Instagramming your meal here, just the silent acknowledgement that food is survival and survival is sacred. Now here's your first quirky fact of the evening. Vikings weren't huge fans of tableware. Forks not a thing. Most folks use knives personal, always at the belt, chunks of bread as edible plates, and sometimes luxury alert spoons carved from animal bone. If you're lucky, your stew doesn't melt your utensil. And while we're deconstructing myths, no, they didn't always eat giant turkey legs and guzzle meat from horn-shaped goblets. That's more Renaissance fare than reality. Historians still argue whether the average Viking diet was more hearty or barely edible, but most agree it was based heavily on what could be dried, smoked, pickled, or tricked into tasting less like seaweed. Still, there was ritual to it. A guest wasn't supposed to talk until after eating. That's right, you, the charming traveler, have to sit tight and chew in silence while everyone around you judges your table manners and decides whether your existence improves their evening. If you speak too soon, you risk offending the gods, or at least the host's grandmother, which may be worse. You glance across the fire and spot someone staring, an older man with a beard like moss and eyes sharp enough to skin a salmon. He raises his cup to you, not as a toast, but as a test. This is a moment, a tiny burning hot audition. You raise your bowl in return, trying to match the angle. Not too high, not too low. You mutter something vaguely respectful about the generous hearth. You nod at the fire, then at the man. He snorts. Approval, maybe. Or maybe he just has allergies. Either way, he turns away and you're still breathing. You're learning fast. Viking hospitality isn't just about being nice. It's about being seen being nice. Your host gets reputation points for feeding you. You get reputation points for acting grateful, but not too grateful. There's a fine line between respectful guests and groveling bootlicker, and Viking culture did not favor bootlickers, especially if their boots were still wet. Nearby, a girl passes around a plate of oatcakes so dense they might double as roof shingles. You take one with a nod. You chew slowly. It tastes like gritty stoicism and hay. Still you smile. It's the thought that counts. Now here comes a deeper twist to the rulebook. If you share a meal, you're sharing fate, at least until dawn. That's how sacred hospitality was. Host protected guests. Guests respected hosts. If either side broke the unspoken bond, the whole community might hear about it. Gossip in a Viking village traveled faster than a longship in a tailwind. And let's not forget the superstitions. To refuse food outright, that wasn't just rude, it was risky. A guest who turned down bread or broth might be assumed to carry a curse, a grudge, or worse, a connection to the Draugr, the restless undead. Yeah, nothing spices up dinner like the possibility your guest is a zombie. You finish your oatcake, a dog rests its chin on your boot, you dare not move. The fire crackles, someone burps, and the conversation starts to shift from weather to gossip. Someone mentions a neighbor who let a guest leave hungry last winter. Fell into a bog 2 days later, they say with a shrug. Coincidence, someone else mutters. Nobody answers. You get the message. Never let a guest starve, never leave a hall hungry, and never underestimate how seriously Vikings took this exchange. It was more than food, it was survival, and subtle warfare all baked into a loaf of bread. The fire crackles like distant thunder as you lean back slightly, the oatcake now sitting like a respectable brick in your stomach. Around you, the mood is warmed, but make no mistake, you're still on thin ice, literal and social. One wrong move and your host might decide you're not just awkward, but a threat. And where Viking hospitality starts with broth, it can just as easily end with a bonk on the head and a gentle shove back into the snow. Which brings you to the most oddly spiritual part of the experience, the threshold. Vikings believed that the space between outside and inside the doorway, the entrance, the literal step across, was a zone of serious power. You don't just walk in, you pause, you wait, you make eye contact, or if that fails, you cough politely until someone acknowledges you. This is partly manners, sure, but it's also rooted in the spiritual and slightly spooky view of liminal space. They didn't want their homes haunted by unknown intentions. And if someone stood in the doorway too long, saying nothing, doing nothing, well, that was suspicious. And in Viking culture, suspicious often translated to probably a ghost witch or enemy spy. You shift a little, remembering how long you stood back there at the door, unsure whether to knock or kick it open. Apparently, there's a name for that moment, the guest limbo. Not your best social performance. The sagas are full of people being mistaken for spirits just because they showed up unannounced and said nothing. Sometimes they were literally attacked with hot embers or forcibly doused with ale to see if the ghost flinched. It sounds funny now, but at the time, you'd probably be too busy dodging airborne turnips to laugh. This fear of threshold entities had a practical side too. Remember, homes were precious. In winter, your longhouse was your lifeline. If someone showed up and disrupted the balance physically, spiritually, or dramatically, they could ruin your food stores, anger your gods, or just be incredibly annoying. So people were cautious. Historians still argue whether this obsession with thresholds came more from religious belief or simple survival instinct. But the stories, oh, they're clear. A traveler who didn't respect the doorway didn't get far inside. In some households, guests were expected to state their full name, lineage, and intentions before crossing the threshold. If you couldn't recite at least 3 generations of ancestors and a decent poem, you might get turned away. Or worse, invited in out of politeness, but never spoken to again. The Viking version of the silent treatment could last years. You think back to your own entrance, muddy boots, foggy breath, no poetry. Honestly, you're lucky anyone gave you a spoon. As you sit now by the hearth, a few people glance toward the doorway again. Another traveler number. Just the wind knocking the door slightly ajar. Still, it draws attention. It always does. The door in a Viking home was more than just a plank of wood. It was the line between order and chaos. Inside, fire food family. Outside, snow, wolves, frostbite, and those mysterious noises that are probably just wind. And here's a quirky fact for you. In some regions, Vikings carved runes into their door frames, not just for decoration, but to keep unwanted spirits or bad luck from crossing over. Some even nailed bits of iron or animal bone into the frame. You might think that's extreme, but consider this: they lived in a world where you could die from moldy cheese or angry elves. Better safe than soul stolen. You notice now how every guest who enters follows the same subtle ritual. They pause, they nod to the fire, to the host, to the gods, sometimes in that order, sometimes reversed. It's like a dance you were never taught but are expected to know by heart. Miss a step, and suddenly the friendly meat drinker beside you starts sharpening his belt knife a little too enthusiastically. You shift on the bench, trying to recall if you nodded to the fire. You think you did. Probably. Hopefully. Then a boy barely more than 10 comes in from the cold. He stomps the snow off his shoes, gives a tiny bow to the matriarch seated by the fire, and says, "Fari vel venir." Go well, friends. That's it. He's in. Everyone nods. He moves toward the back of the hall, clearly more comfortable than you. It's humbling, really. Even a kid knows the script better than you do. Of course, there were exceptions. If you were a known warrior, a returning sailor, or a traveling skald, think poet/news anchor, the rules bent a little. But even the most battle-hardened berserker had to show humility at the door. That was the Viking way. Strength earned you respect, but manners earned you survival. Which brings us to your biggest takeaway of the night so far. In Viking society, hospitality wasn't just a nice idea. It was a strategic, sacred, and slightly terrifying ritual. One built on reputation, superstition, and the understanding that everyone is potentially dangerous, even if they smell like soggy leather, and desperation. The threshold is a test. You passed, barely. But now you're inside. Now you have to survive the night. You're getting comfortable now, or at least your cloak is no longer frozen to your spine. But just as you begin to settle into the rhythm of the longhouse, sniffing the stew, counting how many dogs are hiding under benches, you spot a pile of weapons near the door. Swords, axes, a couple of battered shields leaning against the wall. And that's when it hits you. Nobody here is wearing their weapons. Strange for a people who basically invented the mood of, I could kill you, but let's share a fish first. And yet here's the unspoken Viking rule that might save your life. Leave your sword, keep your sass. The moment you cross the threshold, you were expected to disarm. Not just out of politeness, but because it was the law. Or at least the social law, arguably more powerful than the legal kind, in a place where courtrooms were just slightly angry or drinking circles. See, walking into a Viking hall with a blade still on your hip was basically saying, I might stab you during dessert. Not a great look. And in return for surrendering your weapon, you were given an unspoken promise no one else in the hall would raise theirs either. This wasn't some hippie dream of peace and tofu. It was a careful balance of trust tension and well-rehearsed drama. You don't need to carry a weapon if everyone knows you can use one. That was the Viking vibe: exude danger, but sit calmly by the fire, sipping mead and talking about boats. Interestingly, historians still argue whether this disarming ritual was universally enforced or only reserved for specific halls and status levels. Some argue it was more common in high-status homes, chieftains, jarls, the influencers of their day. But even in humbler abodes, leaving your axe by the door was seen as good manners. Like taking off your shoes if your shoes could decapitate someone. And yes, you're wondering, what if someone didn't put down their weapon? Well, that's when Viking sarcasm reached its peak. A host might say something like, I see you're still worried about wolves inside the house. Or worse, careful where you sit, your sword has a habit of stabbing people. Humiliation before confrontation, classic Norse diplomacy. You glance at your own belt. Your knife is still sheathed, your hands relaxed. Good. Nobody likes a guest who jingles when they walk. But here's the twist. While weapons had to stay near the door, it was always welcome. In fact, it was expected. You couldn't carry a blade, but you could carry banter sharp enough to slice salted cod. The Vikings were connoisseurs of clever insults, artful retorts, and backhanded compliments that could start a brawl, or a romance depending on the mead to sense of humor ratio. A man across the room leans over and makes a joke about your boots smelling like drowned trolls. You pause. This is a test. So you smile, tilt your head, and say, at least trolls know how to walk upright. Unlike certain men I've seen fall over from one horn of mead. There's a pause, then a burst of laughter. You passed again. The exchange may seem silly, but in Viking culture, verbal sparring was often a safer and more entertaining alternative to bloodshed. Think of it as a social pressure valve. One saga even tells of a guest who diffused a potentially deadly insult by composing an impromptu poem about fish. It was terrible poetry, but it worked. Fringe fact for you, some warriors were known to practice insults like others practiced swordplay. There were actual rules about what made a good jab, clever, rhythmic, ideally with references to goats or unwashed clothing. Childish, yes, but also deeply effective. You notice now how much of the room's energy flows through this current of dry humor and passive challenge. An older woman teases a younger man about his beard not coming in. He jokes that it's because he bathes too often. Laughter, an elbow nudge, no need for blood. It's a delicate game, one where everyone is trying to rise in the social pecking order without causing an actual pecking. Which brings you back to the pile of weapons at the door. Every hilt, every blade is a symbol of restraint, of confidence, of belonging. You don't need your axe to prove your worth. You need your voice, your eyes, your timing. You watch as a newcomer enters wet and winded a bit too fast. He forgets to pause. He steps across the threshold with his short sword still visible. The room doesn't freeze, but it cools. A large man stands slowly, arms crossed. He doesn't speak, he just stares. The newcomer blinks, hesitates, then slowly unbuckles the weapon and sets it beside the pile. Only then does the tension dissolve. The big man sits. A woman ladles stew. The mead flows again. You exhale, only now realizing you'd been holding your breath. In the Viking hall, survival isn't about muscle. It's about rhythm. Knowing when to speak, when to eat, when to laugh, when to put your sword down and your wit up. So far, you're doing just fine. You've got a warm belly, a decent comeback score, and most importantly, a clear understanding of who not to sit too close to. And that, in the world of Norse hospitality, is practically a hug. There's a lull in the room, the kind that makes you acutely aware of every creak in the rafters and the sound of someone somewhere slowly gnawing on dried fish. You take the moment to shift on your bench, careful not to bump the slumbering dog curled up near your feet. You glance around, assessing the crowd, trying to locate the key players. You're not trying to rise through the ranks yet, but it might be good to know who has final say over whether you sleep by the fire or out with the goats. And that's when you notice its seating order. It's not random, it's a system subtle, ancient, and potentially deadly. Because in Viking hospitality, where you sit is everything. At first glance, it looks casual, people on benches, furs draped here and there, a few spots near the fire, others in shadow. But once you tune in, you see the pattern. Those closest to the hearth, the heart of the home, or the highest in status. The further out, the colder it gets, literally and figuratively. And there you are somewhere in the cautious middle, not shivering by the door, not basking in warmth next to the head of the house. That's good, neutral, non-threatening, a safe place to observe and be observed. The man by the hearth, broad shoulders, silver-streaked beard tunic with just enough embroidery to say, "I'm important, but I don't need to flaunt it." He's the host. Not a king, but definitely someone. His seat is flanked by what you assume are family or perhaps just particularly loyal warriors. They laugh when he laughs. They eat when he eats. When he raises a brow, 3 people sit up straighter. You wisely do not. Historians still argue whether Viking seating charts were based on age, bloodline, or body count. Probably a mix. It wasn't a science, it was a dance. One wrong placement could cause a feud that lasted generations. Sagas don't lie. There are literal stories of people murdering each other because of an insult related to where they sat at dinner. Not what they ate, not who they married. Just seat drama. And the worst offense, taking someone's spot. Imagine walking into a modern dinner party and plopping into the host chair while they're still plating hors d'oeuvres. Now multiply that offense by 1 long ship, 2 war axes, and a deep-rooted sense of ancestral pride. That's Viking-level rude. So yes, there were rules. Rules that weren't written down, but you were expected to know them anyway. Like, don't sit closer to the fire than your host unless invited. Don't put your back to the door if you're not trusted. Don't sit on the end of the bench if you're prone to wandering thoughts or nervous stomachs. That one's not official, but it's strongly implied by the number of blankets nearby. Quirky fact time: in some households, the most honored guest was placed directly opposite the host, allowing them to make eye contact and toast throughout the meal. Think of it as the Viking version of being tagged in every group selfie. High risk, high visibility, and no room for spinach in your teeth. You watch as a younger man, a little too eager, a little too loud, tries to slide into a spot that's clearly meant for someone else. It's closer to the hearth, more central, toastier. Big mistake. A hush falls. The host says nothing. He just glances toward the corner where a much older man, silent all evening, slowly rises. He doesn't speak either. He walks over, places 1 large hand on the young man's shoulder, and moves him. Gently, firmly. Like a parent reparking a child's bike. The younger man says nothing. Just nods, sits lower on the bench, and accepts a bowl of stew that somehow looks colder than yours. You don't laugh, you don't even smirk. This isn't a sitcom. It's a live demonstration of the power of pecking order served hot. From your current spot, you realize you're close enough to catch some warmth, far enough not to offend. A Goldilocks zone of guest seating. You mentally thank whatever invisible spirit guided your travel-weary butt to this spot. Probably Odin, or the ghost of that goat you didn't trip over earlier. And here's where things get philosophical. Viking seating wasn't just about status, it was about safety. Who sits where during a meal says everything about who's allied, who's a threat, and who's quietly observing just in case a duel breaks out over an undercooked onion. And yes, those happen too. In one particularly dramatic saga, a guest refused to move from the host's late brother's favorite seat. Instead of discussing it like rational adults, someone challenged someone else to a home-gang duel on a tiny island, because obviously, blood was spilled, reputations were made, and the seat remained unoccupied forever after. Viking emotional damage preserved in seating charts. You wisely stay quiet. You sip your mead. You offer a nod when someone makes a comment about how foreigners always sit too close to the fire. You smile and say, "Where I come from, warmth is rare," as our gracious hosts. Laughter. Not the loud kind, but enough to suggest you've read the room correctly. By now, the seating order is set. You're in, not central, not peripheral, but visible, observed, measured. And in the world of unspoken Viking hospitality, that means one thing. You passed another test. Careful though, this hall's got about 29 more to go. As the chatter hums back to life and the fire's warmth settles deep into your damp boots, you start noticing the tiny rituals. A head bowed as someone passes a drink, a subtle glance before reaching for more meat, a whispered word before a second helping of stew. This isn't just eating, it's theater. And now comes your next delicate dance step, shoes off, manners on. You feel it first as a draft, cold air tickling your ankles. Then your eyes drift downward and you realize most people in the room aren't wearing their boots anymore. They've lined them up along the walls or tucked them neatly near the door toes, pointing outward like loyal soldiers waiting for orders. Yours, by contrast, are still on, and they're dripping onto the floor, which by Viking standards is kind of like tracking mud through a temple. You glance around pretending to stretch and quickly nudge your boots off under the bench with the grace of a guilty child. They land with a soft plop and the floor breathes a collective sigh. Not literally, of course, but you swear the dog by your feet just gave you a judgmental blink. See, in Viking culture, the floor mattered. This wasn't just where you ate or slept, it was part of the living spirit of the home. The planks were scrubbed, occasionally covered in straw or rushes, and watched over by ancestors, gods, and possibly house spirits who had nothing better to do than keep tabs on your foot hygiene. Historians still argue whether the no shoes inside rule was a matter of cleanliness, spiritual purity, or just not wanting mud near the bedding furs. But sagas suggest that arriving guests were expected to remove their footwear unless invited to keep them on. A small, subtle signal of respect. And speaking of subtle signals, there's the matriarch seated near the hearth, polishing a ladle with the sort of intensity normally reserved for battle axes. She hasn't said a word, but her glance slides past your feet and over to your boots. Still glistening, still offensive. You nod a little sheepishly. She nods back ever so slightly. Crisis averted. Now that your feet are free and freezing, you realize just how seriously everyone else is taking this balance of comfort and conduct. People sit with legs crossed, hands folded, eyes cast down when others are speaking. It's not stiff, it's not formal, but it is attentive. This is Viking manners. Forget your idea of wild grunting warriors hurling bones over their shoulders and drinking from enemy skulls. That's mostly myth. Okay, partly myth. In truth, Vikings had an intricate, deeply ingrained sense of social etiquette. You didn't just barge into a hall and demand meat. You waited to be offered. You didn't interrupt a story. You responded with laughter nods, or if you were bold, an even better tale. Quirky fact, some households had designated humor seats, places reserved for the best joke teller or the guest most likely to lighten the mood. Sit there by mistake and someone might hand you a carved stick and say, "Go on, make us laugh." If you failed, they'd take your spoon. That wasn't a joke. You watch now as a small child hands a piece of dried apple to the oldest man in the room. He accepts it with a nod, then slowly tears off a bit and hands it back. No words, no smiles. But a ritual so precise and ancient, it might as well be carved into the beams above. You sit straighter, hands resting palms down on your thighs. One eye on the host, one ear tuned to the conversation, currently a lively debate over the quality of this year's fermented herring. A younger woman sneezes. Immediately, 3 people say a blessing. Du liefer, may you live, not Gesundheit, not bless you, but a literal wish for life, which given the death rate from the common cold back then, was not overkill. You murmur it too, earning a tiny nod from the host's daughter. Progress. Now here's where things get a bit weird. Some longhouses had guest rugs, distinct patches of floor covering, where outsiders were encouraged to sit or sleep. You're not sure if the furry pile beneath you qualifies, but it is warmer than the bare wood. Still, you can't help but wonder if you're curled up on some sacred sheepskin meant only for left-handed scalds or the ghosts of fishermen. With Viking homes, there's always a chance you're breaking a rule you didn't even know existed. That's the thing about this culture, it runs on invisible boundaries. You're inside the hall, but not part of the family. You're warm, but still on trial. Every action, how you eat, how you speak, how you take off your boots, either builds your safety or chips away at it. The fire pops. Someone passes you a small wooden cup. You raise it off for a low skull and sip. The meat is thick, sweet, almost syrupy, and it warms the back of your throat like a slow sunrise. A reward maybe, or a test. In Viking homes, it's often both. Then a boy brushes past you carrying an armful of furs. As he moves, his bare feet barely make a sound. But you notice something carved into the floorboards, runes faint and worn down by generations of steps. They run along the edge of the hearth, looping in a half circle. Protection, a welcome spell, a warning historians don't all agree. Some say these marks were charms to keep away bad luck. Others argue they were just decorative. But the effect is clear. This hall isn't just a shelter, it's a story. One written not with words, but with footsteps, glances, and quiet nods. And now your steps are part of it. You pull your feet closer to the fire, the chill finally leaving your toes. You glance down the row of benches, noting how everyone, even the toughest warriors, has adopted the same barefoot humility. You're not equal, but you're accepted. For now, the floor is warm, the rules are clear, and the night is just beginning. You're finally warm enough to feel your toes again, which is a miracle considering a few hours ago they resembled boiled turnips. Now you're leaning back just a little, watching the longhouse pulse with life spoons scraping bowls. Firelight flickering across wool and weathered wood, and mead horns raised in quiet rhythm. That's when you notice a shift. The bowls are being cleared, the dogs repositioned, and the host is lifting a hefty horn of honey wine toward the rafters. And that's your cue: mead before meat and toast before tales. In Viking hospitality, the evening didn't truly begin until the first round of toasts. This wasn't just polite celebration, it was spiritual choreography, a boozy ritual of respect that unfolded in a very specific order. You don't just chug and cheer. You offer up a skull to the gods, the ancestors, the harvest, the weather, and anyone recently dead or gloriously still alive. It's all a bit like casting a wide net of praise and hoping no divine entity feels snubbed. The host stands slowly, horn-raised eyes scanning the hall. The noise dims. And then in a gravelly, half-sung voice, he gives the first toast to Odin, who sees all, even the spots we forget to wash. Laughter ripples. Everyone drinks. You do too. It's sweet, thick, and stronger than it smells. And just like that, you're in the middle of a Viking symbol, a structured drinking feast, where each round has rules, each sip has weight, and each guest is expected to participate, whether by praising a deity or telling a story. You hear a toast to Thor, one to Freya, one to someone's dead grandmother who once killed a wolf with her bare hands. Unclear if that part's exaggerated, but no one questions it. Now it's your turn. The horn is passed your way, sticky and warm. You panic for a moment. Do you know enough Viking gods to improvise something meaningful? Loki too controversial. Njord, not poetic enough. Then you remember a name, Bragi, god of poetry and eloquence. You raise the horn with both hands and say to Bragi, who helps strangers find words in rooms full of warriors. A pause, a breath, a few approving grunts. You sip. You don't die. Success. Mainstream historians widely agree the symbol was one of the most sacred social rituals in Norse life, not just a glorified keg party. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about forging bonds. Once you toasted, you were bound by your words. Toast to someone's health, you'd better help them if they got sick. Toast to someone's victory. You're now spiritually invested in them not losing horribly. And here's the quirky twist: you could toast your enemies too. It was considered honorable, if slightly masochistic, to raise a horn to a worthy opponent. To the one who nearly split my skull last spring, a man might say with admiration and a mild concussion. There's even a saga where two enemies toasted each other mid-battle, which is either poetic or wildly impractical, depending on how sharp their axes were. The horn continues its slow rotation around the hall. Not everyone speaks, some just nod, drink, pass it on. But those who do, they weave their toasts with little flourishes of poetry, tales of storms survived, or light jabs at each other's fishing skills. It's all part of the dance. A woman near the fire offers a toast that begins in rhyme and ends in laughter. Something about a goat, a thunderstorm, and a stolen cloak. You miss a few of the words, but not the rhythm. The rhyme is clumsy, but the delivery is perfect. You realize now that toasting isn't optional. It's expected, and the quality of your toast reflects your quality as a guest. If you stay quiet too long, people start to wonder, what are you hiding? So you speak again, not loudly, not boastfully, just enough for the people nearest to hear. To the fire that warms the bread that fills, and the strangers kind enough to pass me both, there's a soft murmur. Someone clinks a spoon against a bowl. You see the matriarch give a tiny nod. That's 3 nods tonight. You're collecting them like rare coins. Then someone stands abruptly. A lanky man with wiry arms and a face like sun-dried bark. He lifts the horn high and toasts to the wind that carried our ships, the waves that didn't swallow us, and the fish that regretted their life choices. The room bursts into laughter. And now with the toast rolling, the room shifts again. The formal edges begin to blur. People loosen their tunics, let their legs stretch out. The mead keeps flowing, and with it, the warmth of the room thickens like fog. Even the dog seems slightly tipsy. You take it all in the way the fire paints shadows into the beams above the soft buzz of stories starting to brew the unspoken magic of that first toast, unlocking everything that follows. A Viking feast isn't just about calories, it's a ceremony, a performance, a gentle invitation into the soul of the household. You glance at your empty cup, someone refills it. You nod, they nod back, and you realize that in this moment, in this precise golden-edged slice of night, you're not just a visitor, you're part of the fire-lit rhythm. One toast deeper into the long, strange heartbeat of Viking hospitality. The mead is working its warm alchemy, now softening your thoughts like butter on a hot stone. Conversation hums like bees in a hive. Someone starts plucking at a lyre, its notes wobbling, slightly off-key, but charming nonetheless. You lean back content in the glow of fire and fermented honey when it happens, the moment you've been half dreading, half anticipating. A voice calls out across the hall. You there, guest, got a tail in you, or are you just here for the bread? And just like that, the room stills. Every ear tilts your way. You're not just a guest now, you're entertainment. Because in Viking culture, storytelling was currency, and you're holding an empty purse. You clear your throat, hoping nobody notices your soul trying to sneak out through your shoes. A few people chuckle waiting. The silence isn't hostile, it's hopeful. After all, everyone loves a good story, especially when it's not their turn. You start slow because that's safer. A shipwreck tale maybe. Storms at sea, creatures in the waves that weren't quite whales. You embellish here and there, stretching fish into monsters, waves into walls. No one stops you. In fact, someone tosses a walnut in your direction, which you choose to interpret as applause. Vikings didn't just enjoy stories, they required them. A night without storytelling was like a meal without salt. Bland, forgettable. The whole point of these longhouse feasts beyond survival was to trade experiences like treasures. If you couldn't sing, you'd better know a tale. If you couldn't fight, you'd better exaggerate how many people you saw fighting. Historians are fairly unified on this point. Storytelling in Viking society wasn't a pastime. It was a social obligation, and not just tales of glory, though those were hits. Everyday absurdities worked too. The goat that got drunk on fermented apples, the fisherman who caught his own boot twice. Even the tale of a ghost that sneezed itself to death made the rounds in some sagas. You take your cue from that absurdity and pivot your shipwreck tale toward humor. A sea serpent who got tangled in its own coils. A crewmate who mistook a jellyfish for a floating cheese wheel. That one gets a loud laugh from the corner. A man raises a mug and shouts, "Better cheese than a ghost eel." Everyone groans, but it's the affectionate kind of groan. You're doing fine. And here's the quirky part, interruptions were a sign of approval. If someone cuts in with a joke, a question, or even a ridiculous aside, it means they're engaged. In fact, some stories were co-created on the fly. One person starts another, jumps in with a correction. Actually, the sea was full of stinging toads, and soon the whole room's reshaping the tale like clay passed from hand to hand. It's chaotic, yes, but it's also communal memory. The story becomes a shared artifact, smoothed and sharpened by everyone's imagination. You finish your story with a half bow, and the room rewards you not with applause, but with something better, more stories. Someone across the hearth picks up the thread with their own tale, then another. Soon the longhouse is alive with yarns, some true, most not all worth hearing. One woman tells of a warrior who was challenged to duel a tree after too much mead. Another recounts the time her grandmother cursed a pot of stew to ward off greedy neighbors, and it actually worked. Maybe you sit back finally free from the spotlight and absorb the rhythm. There's a cadence to Viking storytelling, a kind of call and response built on timing tone and knowing when to let the absurdity breathe. And yes, even in these relaxed, laughter-filled moments, there are rules. You don't contradict the storyteller unless it's clearly in jest. You don't one-up someone's story with your own unless they invite it. And you never steal someone's punchline. That's a crime second only to burning the bread. A young man near you starts a tale of a cursed fishnet that only caught boots. Halfway through, he forgets a detail, what type of boots, and the crowd won't let him go on until he decides. Goat leather or cow, someone demands. Were they pointy another ass? He thinks, grins. They were my uncle's. worn on the wrong feet, always. Laughter again. Not at the story, but with it. And that's the Viking magic. The hospitality doesn't just come from meat or meat. It flows from shared laughter, remembered tales, and the quiet comfort of being heard. And here's a little-known debate. Scholars still argue whether some of the grandest sagas began this way, casual stories told by guests at a fire gradually reshaped over generations until they became legend. Was Beowulf born in a hall just like this, over a bowl of overcooked beans? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a comforting thought. You glance down at your empty cup again. This time it's refilled without asking. A silent nod, an unspoken compliment. You're not just tolerated here, you're contributing. And in the world of Viking hospitality that makes you family, at least for the night. The tales are flowing now, some with punchlines, some with sword fights, some with both. Laughter fills the hall like smoke curling into the rafters, weaving between fur cloaks and fire shadows. It's a warmth deeper than mead, a rhythm older than words. You've earned your place at the hearth, you've told your tale. Now just don't ruin it with flatulence. Yes, you heard that right. Because as much as Vikings adored a guest with a sharp tongue and a good story, there were lines, and bodily noises crossed them. You begin to notice it, the quiet little courtesies. No slurping, no talking with your mouth full, and absolutely no burping contests unless you're under 10 or trying to impress a goat. Which, to be fair, has happened, but not tonight. In the Viking Hospitality Handbook, and while it was unwritten, it might as well have been carved in runes on every dining bench, manners mattered. And the penalties for poor manners, well, they weren't written down either. But that didn't stop anyone from enforcing them. Let's set the scene. You're seated by the hearth. Your stew was hearty, your mead was plentiful. But now your stomach starts to whisper threats. Maybe it's the pickled herring. Maybe it's nerves. Either way, this is a dangerous moment. Because if you dare to disrupt the mood with a poorly timed trumpet from below decks, you'll get more than just a few raised eyebrows. There's a saga half-fact, half-fable of a man known only as Hrolf the Rude. He earned his nickname not on the battlefield, but in the longhouse. One winter's night in a feast much like this, he let one loose during the silence between toasts. Not a polite one, a battle horn kind of sound. He laughed. No one else did. By spring, his nickname had spread across 3 villages, and he wasn't invited back to a single feast for 5 years. Social exile, Viking style. Historians still debate whether such strict etiquette applied across all Norse communities or was more common in noble halls in wealthier regions. Some argue that rural farmsteads were more relaxed about bodily functions, given the daily realities of pig herding and ice baths. Others maintain that wherever you went, there was always someone, usually a sharp-eyed elder, ready to slap your wrist with a soup ladle. Tonight you notice that the mood remains light but observant. A man across the room sneezes, and 5 people say blessings. A child spills a bit of stew and it's wiped up immediately, no scolding, no fuss, just efficiency. You make a mental note, even chaos has choreography here, and there are more faux pas hiding in the shadows. For example, don't brag about your appetite. It's fine to eat well, encouraged even. But announcing how much you can eat, and that's arrogance, unless you're already a legend, in which case it's expected. One saga tells of a woman named Brynhild the Mighty who claimed to have eaten an entire sheep's leg before dawn. Whether that's true or symbolic is unclear, but she was later married off to a jarl who raised wolves so clearly she had something going for her. Another silent rule: don't comment on the portions. Too small, too bland, too fishy. Keep it to yourself. You're a guest, not a restaurant critic. To insult a Viking's food is to insult their harvest, their household, and probably their grandmother. And for the love of Thor, don't feed the dogs from your bowl. Not unless you're willing to share everything with them from that point on, including your bedding. Vikings loved their animals, yes, but they also respected hierarchy. People first, dogs second, goats negotiable. You watch now as someone stands for another toast, this time shorter and quieter. A simple raise of the horn, a murmured name, and a sip. The room respects the hush. No clinking, no jokes. The moment passes like a gust through furs. This too is part of the etiquette, knowing when not to speak. The Vikings weren't all noise and bluster. They understood weight. Silence had a place, especially in remembrance or sorrow. It's why you don't interrupt a toast. It's why you don't cackle during a prayer. It's why, if you must break wind, you do so somewhere near the pigs and not by the hearth. A dog groans beside you, shifting in its sleep. A child giggles. The mood resets. A new tale begins, this one about a man who claimed to have caught a ghost in a bucket, only to discover it was his cousin under a blanket. And there it is again, the flow, the unwritten rhythm of behavior. Laughter, quiet, drink, story, repeat. No one yells, no one flings bones. You realize that for all their ruggedness, these people are incredibly polished. Even the warriors, especially the warriors. You look down at your hands now, clean from dinner, folded in your lap. You haven't spilled. You haven't burped. You haven't once insulted the fish. You're doing great. One older woman leans over and offers you a scrap of honeyed oat cake. Not much, but enough to say you are noticed. You're welcome. You're doing just fine. You accept it with a nod and a quiet "tak." She smiles. No words, just a warm glance, the kind that says, "This one knows not to fart in a feast." And honestly, that's probably the highest compliment you'll get tonight. The laughter softens. The fire burns lower, glowing like a sleepy dragon's eye. Mead horns rest beside empty bowls, and even the rowdiest guests have begun to lean back, arms folded across full bellies, eyes half-lidded. You're feeling pretty good, maybe even confident, and that's precisely when the feasting turns to fighting. No, not all-out chair-smashing, axe-swinging mayhem. Not yet. It starts the way these things always do, with a single elbow. You don't even see it at first. A thump, a grunt, a wooden cup knocked over. You glance up to find two men glaring at each other across a now suspiciously quiet section of the bench. They're both flushed, one with drink, the other with pride, and the air between them could slice turnips. Someone mutters, "Not again." Welcome to another unspoken rule of Viking hospitality. You're always one insult away from a legacy-defining feud. Now make no mistake, most Viking feasts ended peacefully, but a few, well, those made it into the sagas. Entire family bloodlines were shaped by what someone did or didn't say after 3 horns of mead and a questionable side of smoked eel. Take the case of Thorgrim Goatfoot and Eric the Yellow. 2 farmers, same fjord. They once argued over who first planted barley on a shared slope. That dispute, fueled by one poorly timed feast joke, escalated into a 3-generation saga involving duels, curses, marriage sabotage, and at least one haunted shovel. Historians still argue whether Viking hospitality was more about inclusion or subtle dominance. Sharing food created a bond, yes, but also a pecking order. Toasts were a ladder. Stories were measuring sticks, and physical proximity to the hearth that was practically a declaration of social rank. Which brings us back to the elbow. Apparently, the man on the right shifted too far toward the fire, nudging his benchmate aside. A subtle social nudge toward dominance. The Viking equivalent of saying, "My reputation gets more warmth than yours." Cue the slow-motion posturing. The man on the left sits straighter. He rolls his shoulders. He glances around, not asking for support, just checking who's watching. Because make no mistake, feast conflicts were performances. Everything from posture to phrasing could tip the balance between a bruised ego and a bruised ribcage. Here's where it gets deliciously weird. In many cases, fighting during a feast was forbidden, but only certain kind of fighting. If you drew a blade, absolutely not. If you insulted someone's lineage, risky, but possibly allowed if it rhymed. But if you challenged someone to a friendly test of strength, like a wrestling match outside or a stone lifting contest by the fjord, that was a different matter. The host now raises one hand, palm down. It's not a command, it's a question, a quiet, universal Viking signal. Do we need to go outside for this? Or are you 2 grown men who can share soup without violence? To everyone's relief, the man on the left shrugs. Then with a theatrical groan, he scoots over a few inches and says, "Fine, let your backside burn. I'll take the draft and the honor." Laughter returns. The fire crackles. Crisis averted. But the tension doesn't vanish. It just shifts. And that's another secret of Viking hospitality: conflict never disappears. It simmers. It reshapes itself into jokes, songs, passive-aggressive bread offerings. One time, a man named Kettle was served the smallest piece of roast boar at a feast. Just a sliver. He said nothing, smiled, ate it. A year later, he returned with 3 barrels of salted cod, enough to feed the entire village. He made a speech praising generosity. Then, as people filled their bowls, he handed one person a fishtail and said, "For you, Kettle style." Everyone knew. No one forgot. That's how grudges were handled here, with humor, theatrics, and long memories. You begin to see how fragile it all is, the balance of hospitality. It's a shared dance on a frozen pond, One heavy step, one reckless toast, and suddenly you're reenacting a saga nobody wants to be in. You take a careful sip of your meat eyes, low ears open. Not all fights are loud. Some are waged in silence and seat shifts and eyebrow raises. But this hall, it's well managed. The host is experienced. He knows how to redirect energy. He gestures toward the hearth where someone's fetching a drum. Not for war, just rhythm, the kind that distracts from bruised egos. And slowly the hall resets. That's Viking grace. Not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of returning to harmony. No one needs to win. Everyone needs to stay warm. As you glance toward the host, he catches your eye just briefly and raises a brow. You raise your cup, not in challenge, but in recognition. Another test passed. You haven't shoved anyone, you haven't claimed the warmest bench, and most importantly, you haven't elbowed the wrong person after 3 cups of mead. In Viking hospitality, sometimes surviving the feast is its own quiet kind of victory. Section 11. The mood has settled again like snow after a brief gust. The flickering shadows resume their dance across the walls. The lyre strums softly in the background, and people resume talking, this time just a little more cautiously. You exhale. You made it through the tension spike. That's more than some guests can say. Now comes one of the most important and most misunderstood elements of Viking hospitality, the rules of reciprocation. Because here's the truth nobody tells you when they hand you that first bowl of stew or refill your horn of mead. Nothing in this longhouse is truly free. Sure, you're a guest. You've been fed, warmed, entertained, and even spared during a social standoff involving roasted meat and male ego. But Viking hospitality ran on a system of invisible debts. Accepting a host's generosity meant one thing you now owe them. Maybe not tonight, maybe not even next week, but someday. You chew on this as you chew on your third piece of dried fish, which seems to have the texture of a woven sandal. Not that you're complaining, not aloud, especially not when you realize that the host has just offered a second helping to the man sitting beside you, a man who promptly refuses it. Interesting. You watch the exchange carefully. The refusal is polite, ritualistic. "I'm grateful, but I'm full," he says. The host nods, accepting the statement like a signed contract. You realize now that how you receive hospitality affects how you're expected to repay it. Accept everything eagerly and your debt grows. Refuse too much and you risk insulting the host. It's a delicate line and one that often determined future alliances, marriages, or whether someone came to help rebuild your barn after a windstorm or just laughed about it behind your back. Historians are pretty firm on this. Viking hospitality wasn't just about being nice. It was a strategic exchange, a web of social obligations that could last months, years, or even generations. A man might receive food and fire from a neighbor today, then be expected to house his cousin's traveling widow during lambing season next spring. It's like a village-wide favor bank with 0 interest rates, but very real consequences for default. You're starting to understand the power of the phrase, "You must come visit us soon." It's not a polite suggestion, it's a mild threat with a smile. In fact, there's a saga about a guest named Ulf who accepted 3 nights of generous hospitality in a distant village. He ate like a king, drank like 2 kings, and left without even a goodbye gift. The next time he showed up in that village, let's just say he wasn't shown to the good seat near the fire. He got the one closest to the door, in winter, which brings you to a key Viking belief: a man's reputation traveled faster than he did. Tales of generosity or ingratitude were like currency traded at every feast. You might be 50 miles away, but people would still know if you once drank too much and insulted a host's sheep. Even now you hear bits of that unspoken exchange floating in the conversation around you. Did you hear that Joran brought his own salt to Hallgrim's hall cheap? Hallgrim still let him stay. He did, but next time I'd sleep in the woods. The expectations are clear: if someone feeds you, you feed them back eventually. It could be a return invitation, a favor in a time of need, or most traditionally, a gift. Gifts in Viking culture weren't grand or flashy. They were meaningful, personal, symbolic: a carved charm, a woven belt, a particularly fine knife, even a song composed in someone's honor. The value wasn't in cost, it was in memory. Quirky fact: one common guest gift was a small bag of salt. In a world where salt had to be mine-dried or traded across treacherous sea routes, it was the Viking version of bringing a bottle of aged whiskey to a dinner party. Practical, rare, and subtly flattering. Another goat cheese. Not because it tasted amazing, it didn't, but because it was difficult to store and even harder to make without being headbutted by your ingredients. So yes, you'd better bring a gift when you visit next time. And don't think a vague promise of help someday counts. Vikings were known to recite lists of favors owed like shopping receipts. If you said you'd help with roofing, they'd expect a ladder in your hand when the snow melted. You glance at the host now, still seated near the fire, quietly surveying the room. He's not smiling, but he's not frowning either. It's the face of someone doing math. Who arrived with what? Who left with more? Who might return next season with sheepseed or stories? And suddenly you wonder what you'll bring next time. Maybe you'll carve something from driftwood, or memorize a better story, or learn that trick where you balance a horn of meat on your head while reciting poetry. Whatever it is, you understand now that tonight is not the end of this exchange, it's the beginning. A handshake extended across months, a pact sealed with warmed food and fermented honesty. You've eaten their bread, you've warmed by their fire, you've joined their laughter. Now you owe them, and honestly, you're kind of okay with that. You're halfway through your second helping of oatcakes when someone across the fire leans in and says you're polite for a stranger. It's a compliment probably, or a warning. Hard to tell in a culture where tone and intent are often dressed in the same wool tunic. You smile, nod, and respond, "I've been lucky with my hosts." Good answer. Very good answer. Because here's another subtle dance move in the Viking Longhouse ballet: don't thank the host too much. It sounds strange, especially coming from a modern lens where overthanking is practically a sport. But in Viking society, showering a host with praise could come across as disingenuous, manipulative, or worst of all, needy. These were people who valued dignity over deference. Gratitude was expected, yes, but keep it short, sincere, and stop before someone thinks you're angling for an extra goat. You notice how the regulars do it: a respectful nod when served, a quiet word of appreciation when the bread's fresh, a smile after a good joke. No gushing, no fawning. Just that effortless cool that says, "I see what you've done for me. I won't forget it, but I won't cheapen it either." You follow suit. After a particularly savory bowl of onion and turnip stew, you say, "That'll keep the frost out of my bones." The matriarch chuckles. The host gives a small nod, like he's acknowledging that you understand the rhythm now. Historians are a bit divided on this one. Some argue that Vikings didn't express gratitude outwardly because they were too busy surviving. Others say it was a cultural norm. Thankfulness was shown in actions, not words. If someone saved your life, you didn't write them a poem, you showed up when their roof collapsed. There's a famous line from the Havamal, the Viking wisdom poetry, that loosely translates to "be moderate in praise." The words of a flatterer ring hollow. So if you're too enthusiastic, it raises eyebrows. What are you hiding? Are you planning something? Are you buttering up the host to steal a sheep or marry his daughter? Better to be respectful and measured. Show appreciation through reciprocal behavior, not emotional theatrics. Quirky fact: Vikings actually had a word for exaggerated thanks of metnadir. It implied false flattery, boastful speech, or the kind of talking that made everyone uncomfortable during dinner. You didn't want to be that guy. A young man near you once again tries his luck with a compliment. "Your stew is unmatched," he says to the cook, who promptly replies, "Then it must have outrun your expectations." Burn delivered, stew served, conversation moves on. You make a mental note: sincerity is gold, but subtlety is platinum. This economy of praise extended into all aspects of Viking life. When warriors returned from raids or long sea voyages, their welcome was grand but brief. A single horn of mead, a seat near the hearth, maybe a quiet nod from the Jarl. Then it was back to work, back to balance. Praise too much and you disrupt the delicate social scale. You think now about how many feasts must have gone wrong because someone forgot this rule. A guest who rose too soon to declare the host the finest chieftain in all the north might find themselves sleeping next to the pigs out back. Not because of offense, but because of suspicion. Vikings weren't cold, they were cautious. Praise was like a blade, sharp, useful, and dangerous if mishandled. So when a bowl is passed your way, you accept it with a smile and a simple talk. When someone fills your cup, you touch the rim to theirs in silent appreciation. And when the host glances your way, you meet his gaze with just enough warmth to say, "I see you." That's the real currency here: presence. Not platitudes, not praise poems. Just the act of showing up, respecting the rituals, listening when others speak, and adding value to the shared space. And yes, this applies to jokes too. You notice how the best one-liners aren't followed by loud laughter or ego stroking. They're delivered dry, caught with a smirk or a quiet exhale, and then left behind like breadcrumbs in the snow. There's an elegance to it all, a rugged restraint. You're starting to appreciate that Viking hospitality isn't about generosity for generosity's sake. It's about maintaining the sacred balance of honor and humility. You've been fed, you've been warmed, you've been heard. That's enough. You don't need to say more. And yet when the matriarch passes by and rests a hand briefly on your shoulder, you find yourself saying thank you, just once, softly. She nods, and that, it seems, is the perfect amount. The fire's glow has mellowed to a gentle pulse, licking the logs in slow, sleepy waves. Around the hall, bodies have started to slump. Cloaks become blankets, benches turn into beds, and soft snores float upward like incense to the gods of rest. You're still upright, still watching, still learning. Because now comes one of the trickiest parts of Viking hospitality: overnight guests and floor etiquette. You may have navigated the meal without insult, delivered a passable toast, and kept all bodily emissions to yourself. But where you sleep and how you navigate sleeping arrangements might still determine whether you leave tomorrow with friendships or a frostbite. Let's start with a basic fact. Viking longhouses weren't exactly the Ritz. These homes were multi-purpose fortresses of survival barn, bedroom, kitchen, and community center all rolled into one. Imagine an open-plan studio apartment for 30 people and 12 animals. You've got beds along the walls, usually planks with straw-filled mattresses or layered furs. But don't assume one of those is yours, because in this world, floor real estate is social real estate. The most honored guests, chieftains, bards, warriors of renown, might be offered a bench bed. Something close to the fire, but not too close, wouldn't want your hero combusting overnight. These spots were limited and, more importantly, pre-negotiated. You, on the other hand, are a relatively unknown quantity. You get the floor, maybe a blanket, maybe. You glance around and notice people subtly claiming space. A fur is unrolled. Someone slides a bench a few inches left, creating an implied perimeter. There's no arguing, no scrambling, just silent choreography. It's like watching otters nest if the otters carried knives and judged you for breathing too loud. You move carefully, not too fast, not too bold. You find a space along the wall between a slumbering dog and a stack of firewood that smells vaguely of onions. It's not glamorous, but it's warm, and no one's giving you the death glare. That's a win. Historians suggest sleeping arrangements in longhouses followed unspoken but rigid hierarchies. Proximity to the fire was status. Being allowed to sleep beside someone was a form of trust, and sometimes more bedding arrangements could carry political implications. Sharing a mat might suggest alliance affection, or in some hilarious historical cases, accidental betrothal. Yes, you read that right. There are stories, some half-joking, some deadly serious, of guests who lay too close to someone of the opposite sex, only to wake up engaged, or worse, married. The logic: if you were that comfortable next to each other in front of witnesses, clearly the gods approved. One saga recounts a man who awoke between two sisters after a mead-heavy feast. No memory, no excuses, and suddenly, double wedding. Whether the details were true or just comedic embellishment, the moral was clear. Know your boundaries. You tuck yourself into your corner, pulling your cloak tight. Someone tosses you a spare fur. You nod your thanks. Across the room, a man jokingly calls out, "Don't snore near the goats. They're judgmental." Laughter rolls soft and sleepy. Even the goats seem amused. Here's your quirky fact of the night: Vikings used their livestock as heating units. On the coldest nights, animals were brought into the longhouse, not just for safety, but for warmth. So yes, it was entirely possible to wake up spooning a sheep and not remember who initiated it. As you settle in, you notice how even in sleep there's etiquette. No sprawling, no noisy shifting. You breathe in sync with the quiet rhythm of the room. There's a strange comfort in it. The sound of others nearby, the crackle of dying embers, the occasional clink of a dropped spoon in someone's dreams. One child near the hearth turns over and mumbles something about dragons. A woman nearby hums softly in response, a lullaby maybe, or a warding spell. In this world, it's hard to tell where myth ends and bedtime begins. You begin to drift, then crack. The door creaks open. Every head lifts slightly. Even the goats tense, but it's just the wind. Someone rises, fastens the latch, and returns to their fur. The longhouse breathes again. No one speaks, no one needs to. That too is part of the night's ritual protection. Once you sleep under a Viking roof, you're under their care. It's not a verbal promise, it's instinct. The host is responsible for your safety, and everyone in the hall shares that load. If something or someone tries to harm a guest while they sleep, the host's honor is on the line. There's a phrase from Old Norse poetry that lingers in your mind, half remembered, half imagined: he who guards the door guards the peace. And so they do. You curl tighter into your borrowed corner. The warmth of the fire seeps into your bones. The hum of breath around you forms a lullaby older than language. You don't belong here, not fully, but for tonight in this corner, on this fur, surrounded by strangers who've let you in and not yet thrown you out, you're home enough. Just don't roll too far in your sleep. That's someone else's space, and possibly someone else's spouse. You're not sure what time it is when you open your eyes, but you know one thing for certain: it's early. Not early like 5 more minutes early. Early like the sky's still black, the embers are sighing their last warm breath, and the only thing moving is the cold creeping back under your cloak. But someone's already awake. Scratch that, everyone's awake. You sit up groggily to the sight of people quietly rolling furs, slipping on boots, stoking the fire, and distributing dried bread like it's sacred currency. There's no rooster crowing, no bell ringing, no shouted commands. Just a quiet, practiced rhythm of dawn, as if the longhouse itself is stretching. Welcome to another unspoken pillar of Viking hospitality. Wake with the roosters, or regret it. In this culture, oversleeping was practically a crime. You, the guest, may not have chores assigned, but rest assured someone's watching. Not in a sinister way, just in that deeply Viking way where reputation is the original alarm clock. Rise too late and you'll earn a nickname like Sleepy Sven or Snore Thor, and it will follow you to the next village. You rub your eyes and glance around. A few others are still stirring. One man is braiding his beard by firelight. Another sharpens a blade with a stone that's seen better centuries. You, meanwhile, are trying to fold your borrowed fur in a way that says both grateful and not trying too hard. The matriarch catches your eye. She doesn't say anything, just raises an eyebrow. You nod. That's the final exam. You passed. Historically, waking early wasn't just a preference, it was a cultural expectation. The Vikings believed that how you greeted the day reflected your character. Early risers were seen as strong, useful, dependable. Late risers lazy, unreliable, probably cursed by a minor household god. There's even a bit of ancient Norse wisdom from the Havamal, their handbook of maxims that goes, wake early if you want another man's life or land. No lamb for the lazy wolf. No battles won in bed. So yes, being up before sunrise isn't just healthy, it's heroic. You step outside briefly, boots crunching on frostbitten dirt, and breathe in the air. Cold enough to shave your lungs, but the stars are still out, soft and smeared like ash across the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleats in protest at the hour, or maybe at the weather. It's hard to tell with sheep. You return inside just as someone begins passing around a bowl of barley porridge. It's thick, lumpy, and against all odds still steaming. A miracle. You take a portion, offer a nod, and settle near the hearth again. No one talks much in the morning. Conversation is replaced by cooperation. You see someone refill the woodpile. Another folds woolen blankets with monk-like precision. Someone else is feeding the goats, who seem entirely indifferent to the concept of gratitude. And here's your quirky fact. Morning chores were a form of social proof. A guest who pitched in, chopped wood, fetched water, even just tidied their own spot earned serious respect. Not through thanks or fanfare, but through acknowledgement. A nod here, a half smile there. The Norse version of 5-star feedback. One man near the door begins mending a sandal. His fingers are quick, calloused, practiced. Another is brushing snow off a saddle. These people don't wake up so much as resume operating, like a ship crew hitting the next watch cycle. You wipe your hands clean and offer to help scrape out a pot. The older woman beside you raises an eyebrow, standard Viking communication, and then hands you a dull knife and a charred cooking pot without a word. That's a yes. And you scrape, slowly, carefully. There's something meditative about it, like you're erasing evidence of last night's feast, or earning forgiveness for whatever snore escaped you in your sleep. This is the final test of hospitality. Not whether you were charming or funny or brave, but whether you contribute. Because once the feasting ends, the storytelling fades, and the mead wears off, what matters is whether you rise, show up, and leave the place better than you found it. And that's what you're doing now. Quietly, carefully, turning from guest into something more like kin. At least for this one soft moment between night and day. You feel a hand on your shoulder, just a brief touch, and hear someone say, "You sleep quietly." That's rare. You don't know if it's a compliment or an accusation, but you smile anyway. As light begins to filter through the slits in the roof, the longhouse begins to breathe in full again. A rooster finally crows. Someone groans. Another day begins. And you're already ahead of it. The porridge is gone. The bowls stacked neatly by the hearth. The air smells faintly of wood-smoked sheep and whatever mysterious herb the matriarch added to keep people regular. Outside, the sky is bleeding from deep charcoal into reluctant gray. A new day is fully here, and you miraculously not only survived your first night as a Viking guest, but you didn't offend anyone. No small feat. Now it's time to say goodbye. And in Viking culture, leaving isn't just walking out the door. It's a carefully choreographed exit involving warmth, wit, and of course gifts, goats, and guilt trips. You're sitting on the bench near the door, pulling on your still damp boots with all the dignity you can muster when the host's wife settles up beside you. In her hands, a small bundle wrapped in wool, bread, dried apples, maybe even a sliver of smoked fish if she's feeling generous. She hands it to you without a word. This is your departure ration, part practical, part symbolic. It says, "We fed you here. Now feed yourself out there." You take it with a bow of your head and the quietest talk you've ever uttered. This gift, though modest, is a signal, a full circle moment. You entered with nothing but cold feet and cautious posture. You leave with food warmth, and if you're reading the host's nod, write a smudge of affection. And yet, you're not done, because now it's your turn to leave something behind. In Norse tradition, guests were expected to offer a gift of thanks. Nothing grand, just enough to say, "I see you. I value this." Something that could be used, admired, remembered, or best of all, talked about. Problem, you didn't bring a goat. That's fine. Most people didn't. But goats were common thank you gifts because they represented nourishment, warmth, and a touch of chaos, the three essential ingredients of Viking life. If someone gave you a goat, they were serious. If they gave you two, you were either being proposed to or forgiven for something serious. You check your bag. All you've got is a small carved charm you tucked into your cloak days ago, a horse's head worn smooth from travel. It's not gold, but it's honest. You walk quietly to the matriarch and hold it out. She pauses, takes it, turns it once in her hand. Then with no smile but eyes that sparkle, she tucks it into her belt. No words, just a faint nod. And just like that, you're no longer just a guest. You're a memory. Historians agree the guest gift was key to Viking social fabric. It wasn't about the object, it was about the intention. A badly carved spoon could become a family heirloom if the story behind it was good enough. A sack of herbs might win you a place in a saga if it came with a decent poem. Which brings us to the guilt trip portion of departure. Just as you're tightening your belt and slinging your pack, the host appears beside you. Next season, he says, we'll be pressing mead with ash leaves. You should come, unless snow scares you. Translation, you better visit again. Or we'll assume you're avoiding us, and we'll talk about it at every feast from now until Ragnarok. You grin. Wouldn't miss it, you say. He grunts what you've learned as Viking, for I like you more than I let on. A boy near the fire calls out, don't forget your boots, they still smell like trolls. A final jab, a farewell joke. It's a small but critical gift in return mockery with affection. If you leave without being teased, you weren't liked. If you leave with a goat and a nickname, you've done very well. Quirky fact of the day, Vikings had a word for the joy and sadness that comes with parting kveja. It wasn't just farewell, it was a whole ritual of leave-taking, a nod, a blessing, a joke, a warning, a gift. Often in that order. You begin stepping toward the door when one of the children slips something into your hand, a smooth stone warm from the fire. No explanation, just a giggle and a run back to the blankets. You don't ask, you just pocket it. Because you know by now every gesture here matters. You cross the threshold slowly, yes. You remember to pause. You turn and bow just slightly, not as a servant, but as a traveler who's been changed. And then you step out into the morning. It's colder than you expected. The kind of cold that sinks into your lungs and reminds you that last night's warmth was earned. You glance back once, just once, and the door's already closed. You're gone, but not forgotten. You carry the bundle, the carved charm memory, the stone, and the quiet promise that next time maybe you'll bring a goat, or at least a better story. Outside, the frost bites a little sharper now that you've left the warmth of the hearth. Your boots crunch along the packed snow, your breath fogs in the air, and in your hands, the small wool-wrapped bundle of food radiates more than just heat, it carries meaning. You haven't walked far, just to the edge of the village, when you pause and glance up at the sky. A few flakes drift lazily down. Of course. And you realize something else unspoken about Viking hospitality: it was tested most during the worst weather. The colder the night, the deeper the snow, the stronger the wind, the more obligated your host was to keep you inside. Not just out of kindness, but because letting someone freeze to death outside your hall was deeply shameful. Even if they were unpleasant, even if they'd spilled meat on your best fur, the true strength of hospitality wasn't how you treated people in good times. It was what you did when the weather howled like Fenrir and your stew had to stretch just a bit further than usual. You decide wisely not to press your luck against the oncoming flurry. You return to the longhouse door, knock once, and wait. You hear movement, and then the door opens. You forgot something, the host says, not unkindly. You lift your hood. Just thought I'd wait out the worst of it. He grunts and steps aside. That's Viking for welcome back, but try not to snore this time. Inside, the longhouse is already settling into its winter rhythm. Some people are mending gear. Others are huddled near the fire with cups of something steaming and suspiciously green. You spot a girl plucking stray goat hairs from a blanket. Everyone's busy but not rushed. This is weatherproofing season, the time when the world outside is held at bay by furs, fire, and faith in each other's cooperation. There are no guests and hosts anymore. There are just bodies and tasks. Someone hands you a bone needle and a scrap of leather. Stitch, they say. You nod and take a seat. Here's a fringe detail you might enjoy in some sagas. Gods and spirits were believed to visit during storms, and not in flashy, thunderbolt ways. They slipped in disguised as beggars, travelers, old men. To ignore them or turn them away meant risking divine wrath or worse, bad luck for your goats. So yes, people were generous in bad weather, not just because they were decent, but because you never knew who was watching. You thread the needle slowly, clumsily. It's been a while. The man beside you doesn't comment, just watches. He eventually takes the piece and adjusts your stitching, then hands it back. Instruction without ego. You're being included. That's how it works during the storm. Everyone becomes useful. There's a rhythm to it. Patch, stir, chop, fold. Every movement serves the collective. Viking hospitality wasn't just about giving, it was about integrating. Survival was communal, and the best guests were the ones who became temporary kin. Outside, the storm thickens. Inside, someone begins humming a low droning tune that feels older than the roof. A woman joins in, then another voice. Soon the hall is filled with sound, not loud but layered, warm. The host offers you a cup, not mead this time, but herbal brew. Something earthy, bitter, and mysteriously calming. You drink it. You still don't ask what's in it. That's just part of the trust now. And then without ceremony, someone gestures to the bench again. No fur this time, just wood in proximity to the fire. That's fine. You sit, you listen. Hospitality during hard times isn't about comfort. It's about inclusion. You're no longer being entertained. You're being kept. That's something far more sacred. The storm howls louder now. The door rattles. No one moves. The longhouse holds. And you're inside again. The wind claws at the edges of the longhouse like a jealous outsider, pressing fingers of ice into the seams of the wood, rattling the shutters, as if to say, let me in. But no one moves. No one even seems surprised. This isn't their first winter storm, and it won't be their last. Instead, they pass around bowls of something thick and steaming gruel or stew, or the culinary equivalent of, you'll live. The warmth is in the company, not the recipe. And that's when you notice something remarkable. At the edge of the room near the wall, where the shadows cling deepest, sits a man. You hadn't seen him before. Maybe he was here last night, or maybe he arrived after you. He says nothing, eats nothing, moves almost not at all. The others glance at him only occasionally, never rudely, but with a kind of respectful distance. You lean a little toward the boy sitting beside you and whisper, "Who's that?" The boy shrugs. He came in just before the storm, said little, ate less. You nod slowly. You've read enough tales. Now this is the part with the stranger, the secrets and the spiritual rules. Because in Viking hospitality, there's another layer beneath the fire and the bread. You're not just minding your manners for the humans, you're being watched by house spirits. Most Norse homes were believed to be inhabited shared really with invisible guardians. These weren't ghosts or gods, but something in between. The Vaeter, the Nisir, the Husvader. Spirits of the threshold, the hearth, the barn. Quiet, protective, and easily offended, which meant your behavior as a guest wasn't just about pleasing the host. It was about not ticking off the unseen forces that made the butter churn and the goats stop screaming at shadows. Quirky fact, some families left out bowls of porridge or ale at night, not for each other, but for the spirit of the house. If that bowl was disturbed or the offering not made, you could expect everything from spoiled food to sudden infestations of rats, or worse, chronic inexplicable bad luck. Historians still argue whether this belief in household spirits was religious, superstitious, or just a way to explain drafty corners and missing socks. But the sagas are filled with warnings: never whistle after dark, never mock the creaks of the rafters, never sleep directly on the threshold. That last one especially. The threshold was a sacred boundary, not just physical, but symbolic. To sleep on it was to disrespect the balance between worlds. And you'd better believe the house spirits were territorial. You glance now toward the stranger again. He's seated, yes, but just a little too close to the doorway. Someone notices. A woman near the hearth rises, crosses the room quietly, and offers him a fur. Not with pity, with precaution. He takes it, moves away from the door. The room exhales, though no one speaks. You think back, did you leave an offering by the hearth before sleeping? No, but you did clean the pot. You did stitch the leather. Maybe that counts. Because while Viking hospitality was generous, it had a spiritual ledger. Be helpful, be clean, don't offend the invisible ones. Don't leave your spoon in the stew pot overnight. Don't talk about the dead in a bragging tone after sundown. Don't sleep with your head facing the barn unless you want strange dreams. Even the fire itself had rules. You look at it now, crackling low, a few embers spit up gently. It's not just for warmth or light, it's a living witness. In many homes, the fire was considered sacred, linked to the goddess Frigg, or to ancient ancestors, or simply to the life force of the household. You never spat in it, you never stepped over it. And if it went out in winter, well, you lit it again only with proper words, offerings, and reverence. Or you asked the neighbors humbly and gave a gift in return for the flame. You glance around the longhouse, now aware of the invisible web of respect that holds everything together. It's not just etiquette, it's protection. The rules weren't about control. They were about keeping harmony in a world where chaos came quickly through weather war, illness, or worse. You shift a little closer to the hearth, nod respectfully at it. You don't know who might be watching, but just in case, you silently thank the fire for warmth, for patience, for not turning you into a cautionary tale. And when you take your next sip of the herbal brew, you pour a single drop onto the floor near the threshold, but not on it. An offering, a gesture, a learned habit, a whisper into the bones of the house that says, I know the rules now. I belong, if only a little. No one notices. Or maybe everyone does. Either way, the wind howls, the fire holds, the spirits are, for now, content. The storm drags on for hours or maybe days. It's hard to tell from inside the longhouse where the sun rarely reaches, and the sky is just a rumor passed from one chap traveler to another. But while the world outside freezes over, the world inside pulses with quiet energy. Chores, repairs, soup, gossip. And now a new ritual begins. At first it seems like nothing, a group of children gathering around the central bench fidgeting. Then a woman joins them, kneeling down with a basket of wool scraps. Then an old man, then two more. No signal, no announcement, just momentum. And you suddenly realize this isn't a game. This is judgment. Not the dramatic, thunderous kind, the child-led kind. Because in Viking households, when it came to guests, children were often the first and most trusted judges of character. You try not to shift too much, as one of the younger girls, no more than 8 winters old, points in your direction and whispers something. Another child nods solemnly, chewing on a bit of bread that's probably older than both of them. You've been evaluated. Don't panic. This is actually a good thing. See, Viking children weren't coddled. They were tiny adults with chores instincts and deeply inherited social intuition. They were also honest, sometimes devastatingly so. If a child in the house liked you, you were probably safe. If they didn't, well, You might want to check your pack before leaving to ensure your boots weren't blessed with sheep dung. And unlike in modern households where the opinions of kids can be politely ignored, a child's reaction in Viking culture mattered. It was believed they had sharper senses able to detect deceit, cowardice, or the faint smell of troll heritage. They'd grown up hearing sagas, watching guests come and go, absorbing every twitch of body language. You watch now as a boy offers you a piece of dried apple. Test or gift trick question, it's both. You accept it with a nod. No big smile, no pleading thank you. Just the solemnity of someone acknowledging a sacred exchange of shriveled fruit. This earns you a second glance from the older children. One girl whispers, "He eats like a quiet one," which in this setting is high praise. Quirky fact, in some Norse regions, children were given the task of naming regular guests. That's right, nicknames. It was a way of claiming or classifying outsiders. A man who once fell into a goose pond might forever be known as Vigfus the Slippery. A woman with a habit of humming while chewing Sigrid Chutun. These names often stuck through adulthood through travel, sometimes even into written sagas. You suspect, based on your performance thus far, you may be on track for something like Stew Eyes or the Polite One. You'll take it. Now one of the older boys sits beside you uninvited. This is also a test. Will you shift away, ignore him, offer something back? You don't panic. You pull a bit of your cloak aside, making space. He nods, sits, immediately begins poking the fire with a stick. Very officially. "You're not loud," he says, eyes still on the flames. The last guest snored like a bear. You chuckle. "My bear snores are seasonal. I'm not due again until spring." He smirks. A beat passes. Then he offers you the stick. You poke the fire once. He nods again. You've passed. Historians suggest that children in Viking culture served as cultural anchors. They mirrored the household's values. If a child was kind, it meant the home was generous. If a child was suspicious, it likely echoed real concerns. Guests were often told to mind the children, not to entertain them, but to study them, how they behaved, what they repeated, what they noticed. Children knew everything. They saw everything. You think back now to the start of your visit, the girl who glanced at your boots, the boy who offered no greeting, just a frown. They were taking your measure before the adults even lifted their spoons. It's humbling, isn't it? To realize your status in this hall hangs partly on the unfiltered opinion of someone who still believes thunder is caused by a hammer in the sky. But it makes sense. Children weren't yet political. They hadn't learned to fake interest, to nod politely while planning revenge. They just reacted, and their reactions shaped how others treated you. In one old tale, a guest who lied to a child was chased out before midnight. In another, a child who liked a traitor too much convinced their family to host him for months and eventually marry him off to their cousin. She wasn't thrilled. The goats, however, gained a magnificent new shelter. A small hand tugs your sleeve. "Tell another story," a girl says. You glance around. Some adults nod in approval. Others don't look up, but they're clearly listening. So you do, quietly, carefully, a short tale. Something with a goose, a lost mitten, and a surprisingly clever fox. The children giggle. The matriarch chuckles once. You finish the tale just as the storm outside softens into silence. You lean back, and the boy beside you taps your arm. "You can stay. Just that." And he walks away. No title, no goat, no formal proclamation. But it might be the highest honor you've earned so far. You're still smiling when the children scatter, some back to chores, some off to chase a dog that clearly wants none of it. Their laughter echoes through the longhouse like a wind chime in a storm, brief and bright before being absorbed into the daily hum of wood wool and whispered gossip. And now, as you resume your seat by the fire, reality returns in a somewhat comical form. A very smug-looking pig has taken your spot. She's big, pink, curly-tailed, and asleep. You blink. A few people notice. One snickers. No one offers to move her. Because here's a surprising truth in Viking hospitality: animals often outrank you, especially in the morning. It's not meant as an insult, it's just hierarchy. The family pig isn't just a future feast, it's warmth company, and sometimes apparently a seating competitor. So you find another spot, slightly further from the fire, slightly closer to the goat that's been chewing what might once have been a sandal. And that's okay. Because you're learning that in Viking homes, comfort is flexible, but rules are not. This isn't just a cultural quirk. It's a reflection of a worldview where animals weren't separate from the household, they were part of it. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, they had names, habits, preferred corners of the room. and often a better social rank than visiting strangers. It's said that in especially cold winters, pigs were allowed to sleep right next to the hearth while human guests curled up nearer to the door, because that pig is food security, and maybe someone's best friend. Quirky fact, there's actual evidence that Norse farmers occasionally dress their pigs in little cloaks during blizzards. Not as fashion, as function. A warm pig is a live pig. A live pig is dinner in March. You try not to take the demotion personally. You wrap your cloak tighter, stretch your legs, and notice something interesting. The host's daughter just stepped over the dog like it was a sleeping cousin. No one blinked. Moments later, she scolds her brother for accidentally sitting on the edge of the hay pile meant for the chickens. Because again, the rules. It's not about species, it's about purpose. If the pig keeps the hearth warm, the chickens keep the eggs coming, and the goats yell at spirits in the dark, which apparently is a valued function, then they've earned their place. You, meanwhile, are still technically on a trial basis. Guest not guardian, visitor not livestock. And it's not just about utility, it's about continuity. That pig was born here. That dog's been watching the fire since you arrived. That goose over by the water barrel, she once hissed a would-be thief into retreat, or so the story goes. Animals have sagas too. You're just a footnote in their ongoing legend. Which is why when the pig lets out a contented grunt and rolls slightly onto your cloak, you don't complain. You take it as a sign, a grunt of approval perhaps, or at least a firm suggestion that you now share this seating arrangement. Temporarily, you shift an inch to the right, the goat chews louder. Everything is as it should be. Historically speaking, scholars agree that Viking homes were as much barns as they were residences, a necessity in harsh winters. Livestock meant life, and life was precious. There were no separate stables for the poor. The longhouse was a shared space with zones demarcated not by walls, but by understanding. Which brings us to another unspoken nuance: the animals watched you. Not in the spooky talking horse kind of way, but in the sense that how you treated them mattered. A guest who kicked a dog, insulted a cat, or tried to move a pig by yelling, "Not welcome back." You once heard of a man who brought a fox pelt as a gift only to be cold-shouldered by a household whose children had named the living fox that once roamed their pastures Scully. That pelt might as well have been a funeral announcement. He didn't get stew that night. So yes, kindness to animals was hospitality etiquette 101. Not a virtue and expectation. You take a moment now to scratch the dog behind the ear. He thumps his tail once like a stamp of approval. One of the younger boys notices and grins. "You can sit next to me," he says. "I already am," you reply. He nods. The goat stops chewing for a full 2 seconds, which might be the animal equivalent of a salute. You start to see the deeper pattern that this hall isn't just shared space. It's shared rhythm. Every being here has a part to play. The humans prepare, protect, preserve. The animals warn, and witness. Even the cats, aloof and sacred to the goddess Freya, play their part, curling around wooden beams like smoke, purring as they pass by people who don't reach for them. The ones who know the rules. You're learning them now, slowly, silently, from pigs and goats and half-feral chickens. And just as you start to settle into your new seating beside the hay, a girl offers you a small bundle wrapped in wool. It's not food, it's a hand-carved comb, rough, simple, but usable. "For your beard," she says. Even if it's sad. You blink, smile. That's a compliment. In the Viking way, dry and direct. You thank her, and as you unwrap it, the pig lets out another grunt, approval or jealousy, hard to say. The goat finally stops chewing and walks away, mission apparently complete. And you finally understand, you're not above the animals. You're just one more soul sharing the fire. The pig eventually waddles away, trailing the scent of hay-old ashes and smug victory. Your spot is yours again, but you don't reclaim it. Not out of politeness, out of respect. It's her bench now, at least for today. You take your new seat further down the line, closer to the water barrel, and incidentally to the song circle now forming. Yes, it's happening again. The slow, inevitable emergence of another Viking hospitality rite. If you can't say something nice, you'd better sing something worse. A man with shoulders like stacked firewood picks up a lyre with surprising delicacy. He strums a few uncertain notes, then clears his throat with the gravity of someone about to name a king or admit to drinking goat milk straight from the source. Either way, the hall hushes. His song is bawdy. Of course it is. Something about a jarl's daughter, a misdelivered pig, and a misunderstanding involving a well. It's barely melodic, and halfway through, he forgets a verse and improvises something about stolen cheese. The room howls with laughter. Someone claps in rhythm with a soup ladle. And just like that, you realize compliments are risky, but crude songs are safe. Because in the Longhouse, humor is armor. The Vikings, for all their reputation of stoic, axe-swinging grumpiness, were deeply funny. Not always in a refined way, but in a way that brought people closer. Songs were gifts, and a guest who could offer one even badly could elevate their standing faster than any golden ring. Quirky facts: some Viking households kept song seats, specific places near the fire where only singers or storytellers were allowed to sit. Not by force, but by tradition. Sit there by mistake and someone might hand you a drum and say, "Prove it." No one's done that to you yet, but a girl a few feet away is eyeing you like you might have a tune in you. You don't. Not really. But that never stopped anyone here. Another man stands, younger, drunk, confident. His song is a boast disguised as a lament about a boat astorm and a fish that knew his wife too well. He delivers it with the sincerity of a priest and the lyrical finesse of a one-eyed goose. The room loves it. You've now witnessed a sacred Viking paradox. To be truly welcomed, you must risk humiliation. You must offer something personal, risky, possibly terrible. The host catches your eye, not unkindly, just curious. And then it's your turn. You stand slowly. Your legs remind you that sleeping beside a goat doesn't count as physical recovery. You brush crumbs off your tunic, and you begin. Not a song exactly, more like a spoken rhythm. You steal a beat from the fire, crackle a line from a tale you once heard in a different place, a different time. You tell of your arrival, the threshold, the stew, the goat. You twist your awkwardness into rhyme. You make the pig a queen. You turn your own hesitation into a hero's flaw. By the time you finish, no one is laughing hard, but everyone is smiling. That's better, because sometimes in Viking hospitality, earnestness wins. You sit. The woman beside you nudges your knee with hers. Not the worst I've heard. High praise. You nod. Someone passes a horn. You sip. Not too much. Enough to let the warmth carry you through the glow of the moment. And just as another song begins, this one about a man who married a woman only to learn she was in fact 3 raccoons in a cloak, you feel something settle inside you. Not pride, not triumph, just acceptance. You were tested, you participated, and now you're part of the hall's echo. Historians note that many of the tales that ended up as epic poems or oral sagas began like this: small stories told in firelight, exaggerated, and passed along polished by repetition and mead. No one knew which jokes would become legends. But every Viking knew the value of the moment, the risk it took to speak, to perform, to offer something of yourself. Even if it was weird, especially if it was weird. The song ends. Applause comes in the form of laughter, bowl thumps, and one triumphant belch. You raise your cup again, not to toast this time, just to sip in rhythm with the people around you. And that's when it hits you. You came here a stranger. Now you're a story. The laughter fades, but the echo of it lingers in your chest like a remembered drumbeat. People are stretching now, yawning, settling into the gentle lull that follows performance. Some have wandered toward the back of the hall to sharpen blades, mend cloaks, or exchange gossip about whose sheep mysteriously changed ownership during the last storm. You think you're safe. You think you've earned a quiet moment. Then someone turns to you and says, "So stranger, if you can't sing again, at least say something nice about someone, or we'll make you eat last." A ripple of chuckles. You've been cornered politely, playfully, but cornered all the same. Because in Viking hospitality, when the songs die down, compliments take their place. But here's the catch: you better mean it. Vikings didn't throw flattery around like flower petals. In fact, compliments were tactical weapons used to lift spirits, earn favors, settle tension, or occasionally stir just enough embarrassment to turn a boastful warrior into a blushing fool. So now it's your turn. Again. You stand. A little slower this time. Your knees creak in protest. The pig snorts without even looking up. But the people, they were watching. You scan the room. A few names have stuck in your mind: the boy who gave you a fire stick, the woman who offered stew with a scowl, the old man who silently adjusted your stitching like you were a half-drunk apprentice. You pick your target. To the matriarch you say, raising your cup, who speaks little but whose ladle could command armies. A pause. Then someone laughs, a short, sharp cackle. It's her. She raises one eyebrow. Be careful. Compliments cost extra bread around here. More laughter. The ice is broken again. You continue a word of praise for the host's steadiness. Another for the dog's refusal to abandon his post, and even one for the goat, who taught me the value of personal space. The compliments are short-pointed and most importantly earned. You don't flatter the host's beard. You don't compare anyone's child to Thor. You compliment what matters here: usefulness, subtlety, warmth delivered without words. This is Viking etiquette. Say something nice but make it real, or else it's better to say nothing at all. Quirky fact: there was an actual tradition of complimentary duels in some Norse gatherings. Two people would stand and trade compliments in increasing absurdity until one couldn't top the other. Like poetic roasting, but wholesome. One recorded battle included such gems as, "Your boots have trod on clouds and I swear I heard them sigh," while your stew once made a god weep. "Oh, your hair's so golden it scared off a bear who feared divine punishment." You're not quite there yet, but you can feel the tone shift. You've moved from guest to participant now to giver, because Viking hospitality doesn't just revolve around the host. It relies on guests giving back with effort, story rhythm, and words. And if you can't give, then you can at least uplift. You watch as the host nods at your final line. He doesn't speak, but he doesn't have to. You've done what's expected. Not too much, not too little, just right. A woman nearby turns and says, "Next time, bring a song and a compliment." Another laughs, and maybe a pig. "Ours is getting territorial." You bow your head. "If I can catch one, who'll travel?" The dog wags his tail. Someone clinks their bowl against yours in quiet solidarity, because in this house, your words are your wealth. Not coins, not clothes, just what you say and how you say it. And today, your balance sheet is solid. You sit again closer to the fire now. The pig has retreated, possibly offended. The goat is chewing in a corner, lost in thought. You warm your hands. You breathe. You're not the best guest this hall has ever seen, but you're no longer just a stranger. You're someone who gave something back. And in the long memory of Viking hospitality, that is everything. The mood has mellowed once again. The storm outside has quieted to a sullen whimper, defeated by thick walls, warm stew, and collective stubbornness. You've survived fire song judgment and goat adjacency. It's a good run. But now you're faced with a subtler challenge. A bowl is passed to you, simple, steaming, filled with something greenish-brown and unidentifiable. The cook nods. "Special herbs," she says. "From the hills." You try not to squint at the floating bits. You try not to think of moss, or worse, mystery meat. Because here's another rarely spoken, deeply strategic ritual of Viking hospitality. How to politely decline poison. Now, is it actually poison? Almost definitely not. But historically speaking, Norse tales are not short on accidental poisoning incidents. Some real, some exaggerated, some featuring mistimed mushroom experiments, and one saga that suggests someone once died from angry herbs. So what do you do when someone hands you a bowl of maybe, probably, possibly lethal hospitality? You don't insult it, you don't sniff it dramatically, you absolutely don't say, "What is this?" You sip. Just enough, just barely. You smile with your eyes, not your mouth. And you say the magic phrase, "strong," very strong. Because in Viking etiquette, honest confusion is fine, but rejection is war. You take your first cautious mouthful. It's bitter, then sweet, then spicy, then bitter again. Your tongue isn't sure if it's grateful or offended. The cook raises an eyebrow. You swallow. Strong, very strong. She grunts. That's a pass. Quirky fact. Some Viking hosts tested guests with strange dishes. Not to kill them usually, but to measure their courage. To see if they'd flinch, or complain, or gag loudly and fall dramatically onto the floor. That last one, it did happen. Once. He was not invited back. There were even coded phrases for when something was suspect. It has a bold flavor. Equal sign, I can't feel my teeth. Reminds me of the C equal sign, I suspect this is fermented fish. Wakes you up, equal sign. I think I just ate a potion. You finish the bowl or most of it. Someone pats your back hard enough to shift a rib and says, "You'll dream well tonight." That may or may not be a warning. Still, you made it through. Barely. Without gagging or hallucinating, which is the Viking version of fine dining success. Now the host is pouring another round of mead. You decline gracefully. You place your hand over your cup and say, "I'd like to remember my name in the morning." This earns an approving snort. A woman across the fire raises her cup and says, "Fair. After Torvald's turnip brew last year, we lost 2 cousins in a memory of Tuesday." You nod sagely. "I've heard the legends. Because here's the trick. You don't need to drink everything. You just need to respect what's offered. The mead, the herbs, the ancient bread that could be used to patch roofs. You treat it all with reverence. You sip, you smile. You let them see that you understand hospitality is sacred even when it's slightly toxic. And if something's truly inedible, there's one final trick: pass it to the dog. Carefully, casually. Only if the dog accepts it, because if the dog refuses, you've really made a mistake. Tonight, though, you're lucky. The last few spoonfuls of your herbal stew vanish into the mouth of your furry benchmate, who seems grateful. The cook sees it, says nothing. That in itself is forgiveness. You lean back your stomach, swirling like a confused lake spirit, and you grin. Not because you love the taste, but because you survived it with manners intact. And here in this fire-lit world of ancient rules and invisible tests, that's better than dessert. You sit quietly now, warm and full of something. Whether that something is courage-fermented root or a slow-moving hallucination remains unclear. Either way, the room sways gently, not with motion, but with mood. The hall is softer now, calmer. That's when you feel it, a sudden hush. Not total silence, but the kind of pause that hovers just before something happens. Someone nudges you lightly and mutters, "Be careful." You're sitting in the flirting zone. You blink. The what now? Welcome to yet another rule of Viking hospitality. One that's rarely written down and often misinterpreted: flirting, feasting, and fatal faux pas. Because in a Viking longhouse, especially after mead and music, intentions start to shift. Glances get longer. Smiles last a beat too long. And suddenly you're not just a guest, you're a potential option. That's right. The same fire that warms the hall also thaws hearts, melts boundaries, and occasionally ignites something far more complicated than a story or a song. But here's the kicker: flirting wasn't just playful. It was political, strategic, occasionally lethal. You now find yourself in dangerous territory. If you say something charming, you might end up married. If you say something too charming, you might end up buried. A woman across the fire smiles at you, not seductively, just knowingly. She says, "That story you told earlier, did it really happen?" Your heart thumps. You respond carefully. Mostly, the goat was fictional. Laughter, good, light, safe, and non-committal. Because Viking households had a highly coded courtship system, and much of it happened exactly here in communal feasts under flickering firelight, with everyone watching and pretending they weren't. Quirky fact: in many Norse communities, feasting was the primary dating venue. There were no apps, no profile scrolls. Just a very public, very delicate dance of glances, gift exchanges, shared drink, and very pointed poems. And it was a two-way risk. Express interest in someone who wasn't available, big mistake. Accept a flirtation and back out too late. Even worse, entire blood feuds have been traced back to misunderstandings over a shared cup of mead and a compliment about someone's hair. You recall now one saga about a man who toasted a woman 3 times in a row without speaking to her parents first. That night, he left the hall with a black eye, a broken betrothal contract, and an earful of very colorful language, in poetic verse. So now you're navigating your words like a narrow mountain path in the fog. You nod to the woman. She nods back. Then with masterful grace, she shifts her attention to the man beside you, tossing him a light insult about his singing voice. He grins. You exhale, crisis averted. Because flirting here is rarely direct. It's more like verbal fencing, carefully worded jabs, compliments disguised as complaints, and a healthy fear of being overheard by someone with an axe. You lean over to the man beside you. How do you know if someone's serious? He shrugs. If she hands you a second slice of bread, she's testing you. If she hands you her father's knife, she's already told her cousins. Good to know. Another guest gets up now and starts singing. It's slower, gentler, a love ballad wrapped in metaphors about boat ropes and fishing nets. Everyone groans. Not because it's bad, because it's obvious. He's singing to someone. She's blushing. Her uncle is sharpening something in the background. See dangerous waters. Still, the ritual serves a purpose. In a world where marriages were alliances and romantic feelings could shape entire village dynamics, feasts like these were matchmaking grounds. The host might be watching who sits with who shares food, who doesn't. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone leaves a feast with more than a good story. They leave with intentions. But you're careful. You compliment someone's boots. You ask about their ox. You offer no poetry, just a respectful distance and an exaggerated interest in a nearby dog. It works, for now. Because the truth is, to flirt in a Viking hall was to wager your future, and you're just trying to survive the weekend. You drink your mead, you chuckle at the right jokes, you keep your eyes mostly on the fire, and as someone brushes past you, just a hand on your shoulder in passing, you smile without turning. That too is an answer. The fire crackles louder now, as if it too has grown confident from all the songs and sideways glances. The hall is fully alive, pulsing with the heat of stories, stew, and subtle tension. But not all tension is romantic. Sometimes, often, it's competitive. Because the next Viking hospitality ritual sneaks in when the flirting fizzles and the music pauses. A different kind of energy fills the room now. The laughter gets sharper, the movement's more deliberate. Someone slams a tankard down, not angrily, but with intent. You brace yourself. Welcome to another longhouse tradition, the boast-off. Yes, a real thing. Equal parts bravado, exaggeration, social test, and strategic resume drop. One man stands, not a warrior, a weaver maybe. He clears his throat like a bishop before a duel. I once made a cloak so fine, he says, that a visiting jarl mistook it for cloud and tried to bless it. Polite chuckles. Another joins in. Younger, louder. I caught a fish as long as my boat. It looked me in the eyes and wept. Louder chuckles. Then a woman chimes in from her seat, not even standing. I birthed 2 sons during a storm while repairing a roof and scolding my husband. That one gets a cheer. Because here's the thing in Viking culture, boasting wasn't just allowed, it was expected. But not arrogant boasting, not empty chest pounding, clever boasting, funny boasting, specific boasting, and ideally boasting that hid a grain of truth under the exaggeration. Mainstream historical fact. These were called flighting contests, a kind of verbal sparring match where individuals traded insults, boasts, and clever retorts in public, often during feasts. And like everything else, it had rules. Rule 1, never boast without humor. Rule 2, never boast too much above your station. Rule 3, if someone boasts about you, don't deny it, build on it. The host rises now. Last winter, he says, I killed a bear with a stick. The stick was on fire. The fire was scared. Uproarious laughter. You're next. Oh yes. The room turns. Your turn. No one says it, but they all lean just slightly in your direction. Even the dog lifts its head. You clear your throat. I once told a story so strange you begin that a goat stopped chewing just to judge me. The room erupts. The goat coincidentally is chewing again. You press on. I shared a bench with a pig who stole my seat and my dignity. I left with neither and thanked her for the honor. More laughter. You're not trying to outdo, just to belong. And that's the point. Hospitality here is earned in layers, first by respect, then by effort, and finally by confidence. Not ego, just the courage to join in. Quirky tradition. In some regions, boasting was how reputations were made official. A man's worth wasn't sealed until he spoke it aloud and others nodded. Truth became legacy, spoken by firelight. But it wasn't all self-flattery. Some boasts were compliments in disguise. A man might say, I fought beside Einar, once barely made it out alive, which really means Einar is a beast and I survived. A young boy stands up now. His voice cracks. I carried wood for the fire, twice, without dropping it. Applause whistles. Someone calls out, marry him now, you laugh. Genuinely, because here in this glow with embers dancing and pride humming gently between the beams, you understand these boasts are threads. Each one stitched into the tapestry of memory, thick with laughter, steeped in warmth. And maybe, just maybe, someone will boast about you one day. That quiet guest, the one who came in soaked, sat near a pig, and left behind a tale worth retelling. For now, though, you just smile and raise your cup. The dog puts his head in your lap, and the goat at long last nods. The fire has dropped to embers now, glowing like sleepy eyes beneath the logs. Most of the younger guests have drifted into corners, curled under cloaks, or tucked into hay. The noise has faded to murmurs and crackling wood. Even the goat has dozed off mid-chew. You stretch your legs gently so as not to disturb the pig, and notice something, a figure crouched in shadow, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate rhythm. That's not ominous at all, but no one else reacts. In fact, one of the women nearby offers the sharpener a piece of flatbread without blinking, which means this isn't aggression. This is guard duty. Because even in the warm belly of Viking hospitality, there's always someone watching. Tonight's unspoken lesson, protection paranoia, and the hospitality of vigilance. It's not about fear, it's about realism. Viking households were warm, but the world outside wasn't. Historically speaking, longhouses doubled as strongholds. Raiders, rivals, feuds, wolf storms, the threats were constant. So while guests were welcomed, boundaries were kept. Every host had their subtle signals, every guest their invisible leash, and every home its quiet watchers. You spot them now, the three older men near the door, sipping slowly, never laughing quite as hard, never standing at the same time. One sleeps with one eye open, literally. That woman who's resting by the entry, her hand stays near a carved staff. You're fairly sure she could knock a grown man off his feet with it before breakfast. Even the seemingly drunk uncle in the corner, he hasn't spilled a single drop of his cup. That's not alcohol, that's training. You shift slightly on your seat. The pig snorts. The watchdog gives one soft woof. Just checking, because Viking hospitality had layers. On the surface, warmth, food, laughter. Underneath, codes, watchers, and unspoken checks. Fringe historical tidbit. Some households employed safety rituals when welcoming strangers, like placing a sword within reach during a meal, or having a second bowl served a few moments later just in case the first wasn't friendly. Hosts weren't paranoid. They were prepared. Even the children played roles. That little girl who brought you the carved comb, you realize now she's watched your every move since, like a tiny, adorable intelligence officer. And you've passed. You didn't pry, you didn't boast too loud, you ate the herbs, you sang, you complimented the dog, you never once stepped near the weapons rack, which is why now someone places a wool blanket over your shoulders without a word. You glance up, it's the host. No speech, no nod, just the gesture. It's a message: you're safe, you're trusted, you're under our watch, and we are very, very good at watching. Because here's the paradox. Viking hospitality was both the softest fire and the sharpest edge. It embraced you fully, even as it quietly prepared for the worst. And you admire it now, not just the generosity, but the alertness beneath it. You look around, the sharpening stopped, the blades sheathed. Someone starts humming a low rhythmic tune. Not a song, not quite, just sound, comfort wrapped in melody. Even in this, there's purpose, noise, masking footfall. Just in case. Always just in case. You settle deeper into your spot, finally allowing your body to melt into the warmth of hay and animal heat. You're not tense anymore, just aware. You've seen the inner clockwork of a Viking hearth fire food stories. Knives signal silence. Trust earned, not assumed. And you sleep eventually, not because nothing will happen, but because if something happens, someone will handle it. Probably the pig. It's sometime in the pre-dawn murk when the hall begins to stir, not with clatter or speech, but with subtle rearrangement. Cloaks shift, stomachs grumble. Someone coughs the slow cough of a man who's had one too many strong herbal broths. The goat naturally wakes up screaming. Morning has arrived, or at least something pretending to be morning, and with it comes the next unspoken ritual of Viking hospitality departure without awkwardness. Because believe it or not, leaving a Viking longhouse was just as delicate as entering. Maybe more so. First impressions mattered, but lasting impressions. They could follow you all the way to your next saga. The air is colder now, your breath puffing small ghosts into the rafters. People rise without ceremony, stretching and muttering. No one says good morning. That's not a Viking thing. The sentiment exists, but it's more like still alive barely. Good, have some fish. A flat stone is pressed into your hand. It's wrapped in cloth, warm, heavy. It's breakfast to go, the ancient Norse equivalent of a granola bar, except it could probably break a toe if dropped. You bow slightly. The woman who handed it to you gives a brief nod, no words. But that's all the confirmation you need. You did okay. Mainstream historical fact. It was customary for Viking hosts to provide some form of farewell provisions to guests. A bit of food sometimes, a blessing occasionally, even a token or tool symbolic of safe passage and goodwill. But just as important, knowing when to leave. Stay too long and you risk becoming that guest, the barnacle on the longhouse, the cousin who never leaves energy. So how do you know it's time? You look for the signals. Someone begins sweeping. That's a big one. The stew cauldron is being scrubbed. Final nail, the dog who once rested his head on your knee is now sitting facing the door. Even the pig turns away. You gather your things, which at this point consist of a slightly chewed comb, a blanket that you fold very respectfully, and a new understanding of how dangerous chairs can be if you sit in the wrong one. You stand. That's when a boy runs up and presses something into your hand. A small wooden disc. carved with runes, roughly whittled, clearly made by a child. For luck, he mumbles. You blink. This is huge. Being given a charm, even an amateur one, means you're no longer just a visitor. You're a story. Fringe tidbit. In some sagas, children are said to be the keepers of truth, their gestures considered unfiltered prophetic or blessed by the Norns. So a gift from a child, that's basically a Norse Yelp review with 5 flaming axes. You tuck the token away, nodding with a gratitude too deep for words. You move toward the door, but before you can open it, the host appears. He looks at you, you look at him, and then he says exactly 4 words. Come again, or don't. You grin. That's as warm as Viking farewells get. Open scholarly debate. Some historians argue over how formal Viking goodbyes truly were, whether the sparse words were cultural brevity or just intense introversion masquerading as stoicism. Either way it works. You step out into the morning mist, and as your boots crunch over the frost-laced ground, you feel something inside you shift. You are no longer a guest. You are a carrier of fire. Not the literal kind, let's not burn things, but the warmth, the memory, the rhythm of a hall that welcomed you, tested you, and somehow didn't cook you into the stew. You glance back once. The door closes behind you. No wave, no final glance, just silence, the good kind. And somewhere faint and fading behind you, the goat screams again. The road away from the hall is quiet, wrapped in mist like a woolen cloak, too big for the world. Your breath floats ahead of you a few sleepy paces at a time. The wooden disc the boy gave you swings gently in your pocket. You still haven't dared look at it too closely, afraid it might crumble, or worse, be powerful enough to summon a squirrel god. But the silence doesn't last, because no Viking tale ends in silence. They end in retelling, which brings you to tonight's final hospitality ritual, gossip glory, and how your visit will be remembered. Because in the Norse world, what people said about you after you left was everything. You walk maybe 20 paces before you hear it, the low murmur of voices already spinning versions of the night. It's not malicious, it's not scandalous, it's cataloging. She didn't flinch at the soup. He laughed at old Ragnar's joke. Nobody laughs at Ragnar's jokes. He gave his last piece of bread to the dog. That's dangerous generosity. You're being woven into their oral memory. Not a saga, not quite, but a side note. And side notes matter. Mainstream historical fact. Norse culture was largely oral. That means most stories, gossip, warnings, even business deals were remembered by narration. The way you behaved, the things you said, how much mead you could hold it, would all echo far longer than your actual footprints. This is why so many sagas open not with once upon a time, but with there was a man, and he was known for, followed by a list of peculiar but memorable traits. Your legacy begins the moment you leave, and Viking hospitality. It includes the hospitality of remembrance. Quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, guests would leave behind a token, a carving, a rune, even a smear of ash on a beam, so their story had a place to live. Some longhouses became palimpsests of visitor memory, like very smoky, very dangerous guest books. You, though, left something better, a night full of restraint. One solid goat joke, a bearable singing voice, and no visible theft. High marks. You crest a small hill. The hall disappears behind the rise. And though you're alone again, you realize you're not really alone, because you're now carrying the weight of your story and the obligation to tell it right. In another hall someday, you'll say, I once stayed with a family where the pigs snored louder than the men, where flirting could start a feud, and where stew might be poison, but probably isn't. And when I left, a boy gave me a charm and the dog looked sad. And someone will laugh, someone else will nod, and someone maybe will ask, do you remember the host name? And you'll pause, because names fade, but stories, they ferment, like the mead, like the bread, like everything else that starts simple and ends legendary. You take out the token now, finally brave enough to look. It's crooked, it's uneven, it's perfect. The rune carved in the center looks suspiciously like a goose falling over. You have no idea what it means. You tuck it back into your pocket and keep walking. Ahead of you, a different valley, a colder wind, a new hall with its own rules. Behind you, a story, a memory, a place you survived with grace mostly and humor definitely. Somewhere that host is settling back by the fire saying he was quiet, ate the herbs, didn't flirt with the wrong cousin, might have charmed the pig. You smile. You've been hosted. Now you host your own legend. Your feet carry you further now across fields still sparkling with frost, and through low-lying woods where the trees creak like sleepy elders. The sun rises reluctantly, as if it too partied a little too hard in the longhouse last night. You're not in a rush after all you've just passed through one of the oldest rites in the Norse world. And as you walk, you reflect. Because Viking hospitality, you realize, wasn't just about comfort or food or fire. It was about belonging, if only for a night. It tested you, shaped you, and left its fingerprint right on your memory. But here's the thing, they never tell you in the sagas. Every guest was also a mirror. The way you were treated said something about them. The way you acted said something about you. Which brings us to this final invisible custom, reciprocity in reputation. You see, Viking hospitality didn't stop at the doorstep. It followed people. It traveled as stories, as impressions, as warnings, and welcome mats. And the truly generous didn't just host well, they spread that warmth onward. So now it's your turn. A man trudges towards you on the same road leading a cart with a crooked wheel and a sheep that seems to be chewing the reins out of protest. He looks tired, cold, possibly lost. You could walk past, pretend you're late for something. Instead, you stop. You nod. He nods. And that's it, invitation accepted. You point him toward the hall. You'll like the stew, you say, then pause. Eat the herbs, trust the pig. He raises an eyebrow. You just smile. Mainstream historical truth guests often served as messengers of reputation. A traveler's account could raise a host standing across neighboring villages or sink it. If you praised the hospitality you received, you didn't just honor the host, you made them powerful. It meant more travelers, more alliances, better marriages, safer winters. In fact, some argue Viking hospitality was an early form of social currency. No coins needed, just stories, good ones. And as you walk again, you think about how many of those you've gathered, the flirting zone, the tactical boasting, the pig who may or may not be clairvoyant. That moment you didn't die from the soup. You realize now that Viking hospitality wasn't passive kindness. It was an active performance, a layered symbolic strategic experience where every gesture meant something and nothing was ever truly casual. Quirky fringe fact. Some Vikings believed that the way you treated strangers affected your standing in the afterlife. If Odin himself passed through your hall, disguised as a tired traveler, and you gave him nothing but cold broth and sarcasm, guess who's not getting into Valhalla, you, my friend? You. And that idea that any guest could be a god kept even the gruffest host from skipping the stew or hiding the mead. So now as the mist finally begins to burn off and you reach a fork in the trail, you stop and look back one more time. The longhouse is gone, swallowed by distance, but in your chest, still glowing. You didn't just stay the night. You participated in something ancient, something sacred, something chaotic and muddy and occasionally meat-flavored. And now you get to carry it forward. You'll know when to set out a bowl before someone knocks. You'll recognize a good boast from a bad one. You'll keep one eye open during feasts and one joke ready for the goat, because you've been taught the unspoken rules, and once learned that they don't leave you. They become part of the way you sit, share, speak. They become part of your own hall, wherever you build it next. Your feet carry you further now across fields still sparkling with frost and through low-lying woods where the trees creak like sleepy elders. The sun rises reluctantly, as if it too partied a little too hard in the longhouse last night. You're not in a rush after all you've just passed through one of the oldest rites in the Norse world. And as you walk, you reflect. Because Viking hospitality, you realize, wasn't just about comfort or food or fire. It was about belonging, if only for a night. It tested you, shaped you, and left its fingerprint right on your memory. But here's the thing, they never tell you in the sagas. Every guest was also a mirror. The way you were treated said something about them. The way you acted said something about you. Which brings us to this final invisible custom, reciprocity in reputation. You see, Viking hospitality didn't stop at the doorstep. It followed people. It traveled as stories, as impressions, as warnings, and welcome mats. And the truly generous didn't just host well, they spread that warmth onward. So now it's your turn. A man trudges towards you on the same road leading a cart with a crooked wheel and a sheep that seems to be chewing the reins out of protest. He looks tired, cold, possibly lost. You could walk past, pretend you're late for something. Instead, you stop. You nod. He nods. And that's it, invitation accepted. You point him toward the hall. You'll like the stew, you say, then pause. Eat the herbs, trust the pig. He raises an eyebrow. You just smile. Mainstream historical truth guests often served as messengers of reputation. A traveler's account could raise a host standing across neighboring villages or sink it. If you praised the hospitality you received, you didn't just honor the host, you made them powerful. It meant more travelers, more alliances, better marriages, safer winters. In fact, some argue Viking hospitality was an early form of social currency. No coins needed, just stories. Good ones. And as you walk again, you think about how many of those you've gathered: the flirting zone, the tactical boasting, the pig who may or may not be clairvoyant. That moment you didn't die from the soup. You realize now that Viking hospitality wasn't passive kindness. It was an active performance, a layered, symbolic, strategic experience where every gesture meant something and nothing was ever truly casual. Quirky fringe fact. Some Vikings believed that the way you treated strangers affected your standing in the afterlife. If Odin himself passed through your hall disguised as a tired traveler, and you gave him nothing but cold broth and sarcasm, guess who's not getting into Valhalla, you, my friend? You. And that idea that any guest could be a god kept even the gruffest host from skipping the stew or hiding the meat. So now, as the mist finally begins to burn off and you reach a fork in the trail, you stop and look back one more time. The longhouse is gone, swallowed by distance, but in your chest, still glowing. You didn't just stay the night. You participated in something ancient, something sacred, something chaotic and muddy, and occasionally meat-flavored. And now you get to carry it forward. You'll know when to set out a bowl before someone knocks. You'll recognize a good boast from a bad one. You'll keep one eye open during feasts and one joke ready for the goat, because you've been taught the unspoken rules. And once learned, they don't leave you. They become part of the way you sit, share, speak. They become part of your own hall, wherever you build it next. Word count 1099. Section 29. The path dips now down into a valley quilted with low fog and mossy stones, as though the world itself wants to muffle your footsteps. You let it. There's no reason to rush anymore. After all, you've earned a slower pace. You've graduated from mere traveler to initiated guest, which means you now carry the codes of hosting with you. And while Viking hospitality was built around rites, rituals, and a deeply suspicious goat, there's one final shimmering rule worth knowing: hosting goes beyond the hall. That is, true hospitality isn't just about what happens inside the walls. It's also about what follows you after. It's about how you make others feel safe, seen, and remembered. Even if they never say thank you, even if they never come back. And believe it or not, that idea stretches way beyond the fjords. Mainstream historical fact: Viking travelers often became hosts on the road, inviting others to share fires, splitting rations, trading stories under open skies. A kind of portable longhouse bound not by timber, but by attitude. Even now, as you settle beside a cold stream and sip the last of your goat-blessed flatbread, you feel it, the ember from someone else's hearth still warming your pocket. You've carried it this far. You can carry it further. A robin hops nearby, twitching like it's got places to be. You offer it a crumb. It doesn't take it, but it sees you. And somehow that's enough. Fringe tidbit. In some Old Norse villages, people carved guest marks on the doorposts of their homes, tiny symbols that signaled a willingness to take in travelers or indicated what kind of welcome to expect. Like an Airbnb review, but with axes. Some marks even whispered hidden messages. This house shares fire. This house honors bards. This house, don't flirt with the cousins. You wonder what your future door would say. Maybe just this house remembers the stew. Be brave. You rise and brush off your cloak, no longer a guest, no longer just a witness to ancient customs. You are now in some quiet way a keeper of them. The rules spoken and unspoken hum inside you like runes. Share what you have. Let people surprise you. Laugh when it's dangerous. Watch your goat. Open scholarly debate. Some academics argue that Viking hospitality was more about politics than kindness, alliances, negotiations, strategic generosity. But even they admit you don't risk stew poisoning for politics alone. Something deeper was at play. A need to be remembered, a longing to be trusted, a belief that warmth given to a stranger might come back one winter when the snow won't stop falling. So you take the token from your pocket again, the lopsided charm still slightly warm from being next to your skin. You press it into a tree trunk, just once, just enough to leave a small mark. Maybe someone will see it. Maybe they'll know a guest passed here, a good one. And maybe they'll feel just a little safer knowing the world still contains people who were taught how to host by a pig, a bowl of herbs, and the quiet nod of a man who fought a bear with fire. You keep walking, one foot in front of the other. No need for a destination. Just the soft, sleepy feeling that wherever you go now, you carry a haul inside you. The wind is softened now, brushing through the pines like fingertips trailing across linen. The morning has become afternoon, or perhaps it's just a particularly lazy morning stretching its arms toward the sun. Time doesn't quite move here. It unfolds like a story told slowly over coals. You follow the bend in the trail and reach a clearing with a flat stone just big enough to sit on. So you do. Not because you're tired, though you are, but because this feels like a place where a stories settle. And here at last comes the unspoken rule that ties all the others together. Hospitality never truly ends. You see, in the Viking world, even after the food is gone and the fire is out, even after your host has forgotten your face and the dog has given your scent to the wind, something lingers. It's the feeling someone once made room for you, made eye contact, poured broth, shared silence. You've become part of their story, and they part of yours. Mainstream historical fact, Viking poems and sagas were living documents passed orally for generations, not just because of memory, but because they were rooted in connection. The warmth of a longhouse wasn't just in the wood or fire it was in, how people made space for each other in story. So as you sit there, you take a breath and let it out slow. No rush, no next thing. Fringe tidbit. There's a myth that if you tell someone's story well enough, their spirit lingers nearby, content flattered somehow still hosting. So tonight, maybe one of your hosts will sit beside you in that invisible way stories do. Maybe that pig in some otherworldly form is still snoring softly in the background. Maybe you're hosting them now. Because you remember, you carry their voices, their customs, their ridiculous jokes and careful silences, and absurdly strict soup etiquette. You don't need a hall, you are one. Walls made of memory, roof made of rhythm, a fire in your chest that will outlast frost. And so when your next guest comes, whether in story or in person, you'll know what to do. Offer warmth. Ask questions that don't pry. Boast only if it makes someone laugh. Protect without drama. Feed them something comforting and slightly suspicious. And when they leave, let them. With a gift, a nod, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in this cold, sharp-edged world, someone else will carry your fire a little further down the road. Now rest, traveler. You've learned the rules. You've followed them. You've passed.